To the 29th meeting in 2014 of the Finance Committee of the Scottish Parliament. Could I please ask everyone present to turn off any mobile phones or electronic devices? Our first item of business this morning is to decide whether to consider agenda items 3 and 4 in private, and whether to consider our draft reports on the draft budget 2015-16 and on an inquiry into further fiscal devolution in private at future meetings. Members agreed?
Yes.
Members have indicated their agreement. Our next item of business today is to take evidence on further fiscal devolution. This will consist of 2 separate evidence sessions, starting with Professor Anton Muscatelli, Principal and Vice-Chancellor, University of Glasgow. Members have copies of Professor Muscatelli's written submission, so we'll go straight to questions from committee. And I'm sure you know the drill. I'll ask the opening questions and then we'll open out the session to colleagues around the table. And I should emphasise that Professor Muscatelli has made it clear in his paper that he's speaking in a personal capacity and not as a principal of the University of Glasgow. So, Professor Muscatelli, you've stated that there is no single correct answer to the degree of devolution that should be implemented, and that it depends on the level of or the balance of public opinion in Scotland. And you talk about 3 principles which you say should be used to analyse a financial framework: equity, efficiency and accountability. You then, of course, talk about major differences in political preferences and social attitudes, and go on to talk about the vertically imbalanced systems among OECD economies, of which Scotland is, the UK is one of the most obvious. But let's look at some of the issues which could or should be devolved, and one of the ones you talk about is income tax. And you say, and I quote, "Income tax devolution presents the least difficulties." And you talk about further control over tax bands and thresholds. It would be a further evolution of the current system. So I'm just wondering if you can tell us why partial devolution of income tax would be suboptimal, but income tax devolution would be the most optimal solution.
Thank you very much. The reason why income tax is the most obvious is that, in a sense, it is the tool that is used most often in devolved systems. It offers less basis for tax competition around the country, so we see devolved systems around the world which use income tax as a devolved tax, and it's less likely to create difficulties in terms of deciding how the tax should be imposed and what the tax base is. At the moment, of course, Scotland is has already adopted a system through the Scotland Act, whereby in due course it will have some power over income taxation, although as I pointed in the paper, that will only account for about 17% of the total spend in Scotland. At the moment, the way it's designed in the Scotland Act, it is essentially almost like a flat tax which superimposes itself onto the UK system. And once you have that mechanism in place, once you have the instruments to be able to implement that, then it's actually not a huge jump to say, well, you could devolve allowances, thresholds, bans. It is simply, an evolution of that system. As I also point out, income taxation makes up, at least in 2012-13, made up about 10.8 billion of total revenue that can be attributed to Scotland. And if you want to address that imbalance that I mentioned, that vertical imbalance which would allow you to get more accountability, then the only real way to do it, is to start looking at major elements of taxation, and income taxation is the most obvious one. So it's actually not surprising that actually all the proposals to the Smith Commission, whether from political parties or from independent think tanks, actually identify income tax as the most obvious one. It's already being implemented, it's substantial, it offers less of an issue in terms of tax competition, and it should be, it should be devolvable in its entirety if that's the wish.
Okay, thank you for that. And you've also said in your paper that people choose their location not only the basis of tax considerations but also the basis of the public goods offered. And so I want to talk a wee bit more about that, because some witnesses have suggested that if there is significant tax differentials between Scotland and the rest of the UK, that may impact on people's residence choices. Is there a kind of tipping point almost, you know, at 3 or 5% or whatever? I mean, obviously each individual is different, but is there any kind of rule of thumb, do you think, in terms of that, where it becomes significant?
There's no fixed rule of thumb, and to some extent, you know, jurisdictions themselves learn to operate within, you know, those limits. I mean, we see even in very small geographical areas, countries with small geographical areas like Denmark, that you see local income tax variations between local authorities. Now, you might think, you know, it would be easy for people to avoid taxes by moving around, but the reality is they don't, and the reality is that the local authorities themselves will discipline themselves to avoid introducing huge differentials. So, to be honest, I see that as less of a problem. What I would expect, if there are, supposing the whole of income taxation is devolved with full powers over tax bands, the Parliament itself will find the right equilibrium. Plus, as you said, in my evidence, my written evidence, I point out is people choose their location absolutely not simply because of the tax regime that's in place. They will look at the public good offering. So, you know, would I prefer to be in a place that might have slightly higher taxation but better spending on health and education, or do I prefer? It's a personal choice, and there's no hard and fast rules. We do know that that migration isn't hugely sensitive even to wage differentials, so you would expect them not to be that sensitive to disposable income differentials across a country like the UK. So I don't think it's an issue, but clearly the Parliament itself would need to find, the jurisdiction itself would need to find the right balance between those two variables.
What about if Scotland had control over the minimum wage? There's been suggestion by, for example, a previous witness that if Scotland had control over over that, it could create differentials in the UK, which could lead to a race to the bottom. Is that something that you think is likely?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think if you go back to the debates that were had when amongst economists and indeed amongst policymakers when the minimum wage was introduced, everybody thought it was going to have a huge impact on employment and it was going to disrupt labour markets. In fact, the reality is it hasn't done that at all. It hasn't reduced employment. In fact, if anything, it has helped to support incomes at the lowest range of the income distribution. I don't think it would lead to a race to the bottom. I think it would be interesting to see, for instance, if Scotland had powers over the minimum wage, whether it decided to raise it or to adopt something more akin to the living wage and align the minimum wage to that, whether it would really create a race to the bottom or we'd see many companies moving. I suspect not, actually. I suspect, given that most mobile jobs tend to be high-skilled jobs, most of them wouldn't fall in the range which would be impacted on by the minimum wage. So I think it is the sort of thing that could be devolved.
Okay, thank you very much. And you say that as noted by the Holtham Commission, there may be good reasons from the point of view of economic development, job creation and encouraging growth why corporation taxes and other linked instruments like R&D tax credits might be looked at for possible devolution. What would be the benefits of devolving these areas?
Well, the benefit is that if it could be used for employment creation. Now, I have to say that when the group I chaired looked at this in the context of the previous discussions around devolution with the independent expert group I chaired, we did think at the time that the tax competition issues were potentially problematic. But actually, the Holtham Commission came up with quite a neat solution, which, on reflection, might be the way forward, which is that within the UK, in terms of how corporation tax might be allocated to different jurisdictions, it might depend on real economic activity, such as employment, and that could be a useful device. The normal argument against devolving corporation tax is that you can have set up brass plate operations, you can have transfer pricing, and basically companies will just pretty much allocate profits wherever they like around the country. But if you were within a country to relate it or to allocate it on a different basis, like employment, it might be able to address that particular criticism and might allow corporation tax to be devolved. As I said, the main reason for doing it is to allow the levers for jurisdictions like Scotland to deal with the slightly imbalanced nature of economic growth that we see in the UK, where London, for instance, is growing very rapidly, and actually beginning to allow the devolution of powers to the likes of Scotland and Wales around corporation tax might allow that lever for economic development.
I mean, I'm very interested in this point. I mean, which you just mentioned, because you've said in your paper, you know, any differential rates within the UK would need to be linked to, say, employment levels, and you've just touched on that. So I'm just wondering how that would really, how you envisage that working in practice.
There would need to be, I mean, the details would need to be worked out between the UK and Scottish government, and indeed any other, you know, devolved jurisdictions like Wales or others that might be given that sort of power. You could do it in various ways. You could either say, well, there could be an overarching agreement on how corporation tax operates at the UK level, but then the tax is allocated between the jurisdictions, say, on the basis of how many employees a company might have around the country. So, you know, a company might owe X in terms of corporation tax overall, if you take the aggregate rate across the jurisdictions, but then how it's allocated could depend on how many employees it has in Scotland relative to how many employees it has in other parts of the UK, or it could be based on other elements. It'd be if you did it on profit, as corporation tax is normally allocated across international jurisdictions, then that would be a difficulty. I think it would just simply lead to brass plate operations. But if you did it within the UK, based on tax agreements between the UK level jurisdiction and, say, Scotland or Wales or whoever else might be given some powers over corporation tax, then I think you could work out a mechanism to allocate those taxes.
Thank you. And if we turn to the issue of borrowing, you've talked about the need to deal with asymmetric macroeconomic shocks, which temporarily affect tax revenues and devolved administrations, and you're calling for appropriately extended borrowing powers, which you say would be able to allow each devolved part of the UK to smooth out such temporary shocks. Are you suggesting, therefore, that such borrowing should be allocated for revenue spending rather than, for example, capital investment?
I think you'd have to do that. I think it'd be very difficult not to have some sort of smoothing mechanism. Now, whether you do that through borrowing or you do that through an agreement on the extent to which there can be a difference between spending and taxation decisions, but you'd have to do that, because supposing you devolved income taxes, corporation taxes, supposing you also assign some other taxes like VAT, there would be volatility from year to year in tax receipts, and you couldn't simply require governments for revenue spend to have to adapt their spending on a year-to-year basis. It would not be a very sensible arrangement. So one way to do it is to have borrowing powers for that. Now, the way you would then manage that is to have some sort of stability pact within the UK, where each, so say Scotland had these powers, these borrowing powers, it might be given a deficit ceiling or some sort of deficit rule that it would need to maintain over the cycle, which was consistent with the UK's macroeconomic framework. That would be one way of doing it. The other way of doing it would be to say that there is some sort of reserve into which, in years of high levels of taxes relative to spend, you could put it into the reserve, but then you could draw it out. You could do it either through direct borrowing by Scotland, or you could do it through some sort of reserve within the UK.
You talked about excise duties, etc. And fuel duty, tobacco, alcohol, etc. in your paper. But what about things such as inheritance tax and capital gains tax? Do you feel that they could or should be devolved?
That's these are very interesting issues. I mean, turning to inheritance tax, you'd need to find a suitable way of assigning it. It would be easy to avoid that tax. It could be based on residency, but of course, even in the UK, there are issues around domicile which impact on inheritance tax. It would need to be looked at in quite a bit of detail, actually. whether you could really divide inheritance tax by location. Capital gains tax, once you start devolving the whole of income taxation, once you start devolving other big elements of taxation, you could do it. It would move us from where we are in the Scotland Act 2012, where you essentially are mainly managing the Scottish tax, the Scottish rate of income taxation through a Scottish tax code, to a situation where you would need to make sure that tax returns, were appropriately labelled by residency. So if I'm a Scottish resident and I incur capital gains taxation, the HMRC would need to be mandated to make it very clear that my capital gains taxes would then go to Scotland because I'm a Scottish resident. So you need to get those rules absolutely crystal clear. But there's no reason why you couldn't devolve capital gains tax. Inheritance tax is a bit more interesting, but again, potentially doable. But it would be subject to avoidance because people would simply move. If the rates were different across different parts of the UK, people would manage their affairs by moving around to avoid it.
Okay, now HMRC, for example, do you think they should continue to be the agency in terms of, for tax collection? How far should control of tax gathering be devolved?
I'm not an expert on HMRC, but it would seem sensible that an agency could do the job on behalf of the different devolved areas of the UK. It would need to be done on the basis that they would be an agency that would serve not only, there wouldn't be a sort of hierarchy here where it would largely serve the UK and then offer a service at a cost to the devolved authorities. It would need to be done on the basis that, because if you start devolving income taxation on a wider range of taxes, they'll be involved, basically they would need to serve both parliaments if they were, if there was that full range of devolution. So, but you could do it, and there would be efficiencies in trying to keep a single agency that would serve two different jurisdictions. We see that in other countries. I can't see why it wouldn't happen in the UK, rather than having the costs of setting up ex novo a completely new agency.
Okay, thank you. And just one final question before I move to open up the session to colleagues around the table, and it's just to go back to your three principles: equity, efficiency, accountability. You talk about no set of tax devolution arrangements achieves an optimal outcome, but moving away from pure economics to what you said initially in talking about the balance of public opinion in Scotland, do you feel that in terms of the issue of greater autonomy, which you touch on, do you feel that the kind of various political parties have got it right, or do you think that some are too cautious? How do you feel about the kind of submissions to kind of Smith on that basis?
Well, let me stress the point that I make on page 1. I think that the democratic criterion is key to any settlement. I think, let me put it this way, if there were insufficient devolution of powers to Scotland, and it turns out that that's what public opinion is, then I wouldn't be surprised if public opinion then translated itself to saying we want more. I think it's important for the political parties in the Smith Commission to get it right, to actually try to capture what the mood of the country is, because otherwise I think there will simply be very soon, demands for more powers if too few are granted through whatever settlement emerges out of the Smith Commission's work. So, my view is that it really is important, and what's interesting to me, having observed it from when we were doing our work for the Commission on Scottish Devolution, is that public opinion does seem to have shifted towards demanding more powers, and to some extent that's not surprising, because I think what has happened since the creation of Scottish Parliament is that trust has built and has developed and has grown in the Scottish Parliament's work. And I think people initially were cautious, but I think now they're in a very different place. This is, my view of public opinion. I'm not a psephologist, but just observing what the mood of the country and what people say to you. They do seem to want more tax-raising powers, and they do perceive the vertical imbalance as a real issue.
Okay. Thank you very much for your answers so far. The first colleague to ask questions will be Jamie, to be followed by Michael.
Which, Convener, sticking with that area, Professor Muscatelli, you've spoken there of the need for the Smith Commission to reflect what the public think? Do you also think it's incumbent for them to try and involve the public in their process? This Parliament's resolved that the people should be involved in the process. Do you think that's important? If so, how do you think they can accommodate that?
It's difficult given the timetable. They have a very demanding timetable, and in a sense, actually, what's interesting about the
Smith Commission itself, but the entire process once
Yes.
they report and thereafter.
Yeah. I think that's right, and I think that's probably the opportunity, isn't it? When given the timetable of the Smith Commission, and given that there will be a pause in any case before any legislation goes through UK and is considered both by the UK and Scottish Parliament, there will be time. And I think it's absolutely critical that people, their voices are heard, because, as I said, if we don't get it right, we collectively don't get it right, political parties, and we'll be back to this debate again very soon in terms of should we have had more powers devolved because the process doesn't generate the same. I mean, as I say, I've been quite surprised myself by just how much public opinion seems to have shifted even in the last 5 years, 6 years around what range of taxes should be devolved. So I think people should be heard. Yes.
Okay. In your paper, you say if there are major differences in political preferences and social attitudes in public good provision and taxation and benefit structures, then a highly devolved system is more desirable. Does that standard apply in relation to Scotland and the rest of the UK?
I would think so. I mean, certainly we are seeing very different public policy now emerging out of the Scottish Parliament and out of the UK Parliament. One just has to think about areas like health and education, indeed higher education. Now, if you have these differences, then yes, absolutely, a more devolved taxation would be desirable because you need to have the instruments to finance those decisions.
You spoke in relation to the possible further extensive devolution of income tax and presumably other taxes as well. And you suggested you thought HMRC should continue to form the function of being the agency that collects taxes in that context. I think you were saying on the basis that it would be more cost efficient to do so, but we've already seen that with the limited taxation powers that have been devolved under the Scotland Act 2012, that in fact the Scottish Government did explore this with HMRC and they found that it was actually more cost efficient to establish Revenue Scotland. HMRC were going to levy more. So that being the case, could it still be possible that it could be required that Revenue Scotland's powers become enhanced in the context of additional devolution?
Well, and that is definitely a possibility. I really think there needs to be a grown-up discussion between the UK government and the Scottish government on this, because, as you say, the establishment of Revenue Scotland was because of the additional costs, and that's because, in a sense, the Scottish rate of income tax was seen and the other taxes were seen as an add-on. I don't think they should be seen as an add-on. If we have a devolved system of taxation in the UK, which allows Scotland and indeed possibly in future Wales or other parts of the UK to have different rates of taxes, and who knows, maybe in future even, you might see devolution at the city region level in England resulting in local income taxes. Now, if you have that, you should really think about the possibility of having the efficiency of an agency that serves all of the parts of the UK. Now, if it turns out to be more expensive, then we'll have exactly that. We'll have different parts of the UK setting up their own agencies. But it just seems, it seems as if there should be a sort of grown-up discussion between the Scottish and UK government based on, equal level, equal rights to access of what should be agencies where you can pool costs. But as you say, the alternative, if that doesn't work, the alternative is to enhance Revenue Scotland's powers and scope.
I mean, notwithstanding that point, clearly one of the drivers was the cost-effective nature of establishing Revenue Scotland. But another advantage could, of course, be that Revenue Scotland will be wholly accountable to this Parliament in a way that it might be difficult to make Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs accountable to multiple jurisdictions. I think there's an advantage in that more straightforward approach as well. Will Revenue Scotland be wholly accountable to this place?
It could be advantageous. On the other hand, I can't see why you can't have agencies that can be responsible and accountable in different ways. I'll give you an example from my own sector. We have a quality assurance agency which serves England and Scotland in very different ways. We have different quality assurance systems in higher education, and yet they're able to share back office functions. And there are, there might be advantages in having separate agencies accountable, but one other alternative might be to say to HMRC, sorry, you are accountable to the Scottish Parliament just as much as you are accountable to the UK Parliament, and if you don't fulfil your duties, then that the Scottish Parliament could call you to account.
That would require some form of, I don't know the specific legislation that would cover it, but that would require some form of tweak so that they could become not only accountable, but we could legislate for their provisions as well, wouldn't it?
Indeed. And I think actually it leads us into an interesting point, which is that once you start having much greater levels of devolution, which takes you much more into a federal almost type structure, you do need that ability between levels of government, between governments at UK and Scottish level, to negotiate, to take intergovernmental decisions, which I think are really important. And we mustn't ignore that element of all of this. There needs to be, parity of steam. You can't just say, the Scottish Parliament can only legislate on certain matters and it can't have influence on matters which are, of course, of its interest, such as perhaps the use of common agencies, which, there needs to be mechanisms to be able to do that. Otherwise, it's not. Otherwise, we're moving towards a federal type structure in terms of taxation, but not in terms of government structures.
You speak in your paper, you say oil and gas taxation is geographically well defined and could be devolved. That's a point that's been made by others who've given us evidence. You do go on to say that if that was the case, that some form of oil stabilisation fund should be established, which is of course something the Scottish Government has called for as well. But you say if these taxes are devolved, they should be fully devolved. What makes you come to that position?
Well, I think one of the issues that certainly came up during the independence debate was around the oil and gas sector needing some degree of stability and certainty over what policy governs North Sea, because we're at a critical point when investment decisions for the long term have to be fully considered. So it was simply a point around that if you're going to devolve it, and it's technically possible, and actually you can see why it could be done, what we shouldn't have is sort of some division of those powers, because that will just lead to confusion within the sector. So if oil and gas taxation are to be devolved, and technically they can, and that it's a sizable amount, which might help to reduce the vertical imbalance, then they should be fully devolved, and it should be the responsibility of the Scottish Government to govern all aspects of oil and gas taxation.
And that would include the licensing regime as well, presumably?
Indeed.
Okay. And you refer to VAT, and I think everyone that's referred to VAT, of course, made the point that the EU rules are such that you couldn't really devolve legislative competence for it, but you have suggested assignation could be a possibility. You don't actually state whether or not you support that. You can comment on that, but if it was the case that it was to be assigned and taken on board, that the Scottish Government, Scottish Parliament could be formally involved in the setting of the rates, but should there be some sort of consultative role? Should the Scottish Government have to be consulted in the rates if assignation's the way forward?
Well, assignation, the advantage of assignation is that, VAT, as I said in the paper in 1213, accounted for about 9.3 billion, so it would certainly reduce that vertical imbalance and would provide greater accountability. I think it would be natural to have, if you started having assignation of taxes around the UK devolved authorities, to have some sort of consultation process. In reality, we don't see VAT tax rates moving too much, except during times when there's an imperative to raise more taxes. But it certainly would be quite important, because if it is assigned, it would be seen by the general public as a tax which might be the responsibility in terms of setting tax rates, which belongs to the UK Parliament. But certainly in terms of the scope of VAT, it's something which the Scottish Parliament might feel, well, we certainly would like to ensure that it applies on certain goods and services where because VAT is also a tax that has got an impact on income distribution issues. So in terms of overall policy, yes, I would have thought that some form of consultation would be best.
Presumably the idea of assignation is that this Parliament and the Scottish Government might have other tools at its disposal that could influence the the revenue stream. Do you think that the Scottish Parliament is properly equipped to really influence how much revenue VAT is collecting?
It's what if you have assignation, you certainly have less accountability, because you're not able to influence tax rates, and therefore you're not directly able to influence the tax take. On the other hand, I think it would certainly raise awareness of VAT and its tax base in Scotland. It might lead to some interesting debates around, how economic development then impacts on that tax. So I would have thought that it would increase accountability at the margin. Certainly, we do see in other countries that do use tax, VAT tax assignation, that there are debates and discussions at political level in the devolved authorities around that tax take, and that's probably healthy actually, and that would interact with some of the other tax rates around economic development, of course.
And one final question, if I may, convener, the devolution of air passenger duty was, of course, suggested by the Calman Commission, which I know you were involved in advising. I believe both the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrats have recommended its devolution. And in your paper, you say that it would seem suitable to devolve it. Why do you think it's not been devolved thus far?
Oh, I haven't been privy, obviously, to some of the debates. I was actually quite surprised that it wasn't embedded within the Scotland Act. We were very clear that it was a tax which, wouldn't lead to huge amounts of tax competition. In fact, if anything, it might actually help some of the issues around air transport around the UK in creating hubs which are alternatives to some of the overstretched hubs in the southeast of England. So I don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure why it was decided. I suspect it might have been because of the fears about tax competition, but I don't think it would be a problem to do so. And in fact, it might actually be helpful rather than harmful in terms of tax competition.
Thank you. Thank you. Michael, to be followed by John.
Thanks, Professor Muscatelli, you've touched on the area of welfare and benefits. I was just looking for a bit of clarity around some of your thinking in relation to this. You have suggested that some benefits are more readily able to be devolved, and the one that comes to mind continually is housing benefit. There's obvious reasons for that. But others who have looked at this issue have said that, well, that might well be the case. The difficulty becomes unpicking universal credit in general. So can I get your thoughts on the practical difficulties of doing that unpicking?
And it's true that, if you start with a particular structure to benefits, and you say, well, devolve it as it is, that it becomes much more complex administratively. I think one of the things that has to be done is if they are going to be devolved, and I think there is merit, as I say, in looking at things like housing benefits, but also issues potentially like tax credits. I mean, one of the things that concerns me particularly is that if you really want to address issues around inequality, income inequality, you have to really look at low salary issues. So you need to have control over personal allowances to deal with that. But you also need to look at the potential for the use of tax credits to basically help the transition into work. Now, if you say, well, no, that's part of, that's more of a benefit rather than a tax credit, then really belongs to, the benefit structure, and that is reserved, then I think you start having some difficult issues around conflicting decisions, which could impact negatively on low-paid workers, which I suppose makes me think that if you had to, yes, it is difficult to unpick, but I think if you don't do it, and if you don't assign benefits like housing benefit or looking at tax credits or benefits to help people into work, then I think the danger is that you could start getting conflicting decisions in different parts of the UK in terms of what is happening at those very low wage levels. So I think there's merit in looking at the devolution of that for that reason. It may not work as readily with the current structure of benefits, but then, I think we need to perhaps look at that and see how it could be made more linear, and it could be divided more neatly between the jurisdictions.
The question then that follows, if you're talking about tax credits and the use of them in relation to employability, you then got to tie that into the overall income tax
Yes,
structures.
absolutely.
How difficult does that become?
Once you start devolving tax allowances, thresholds, tax rates, it doesn't really become that much more difficult to start putting in devolving tax credits as well. One of the reasons why the UK finds it so difficult actually at the moment to play in that space and actually have a much more efficient system is because we pride ourselves on the fact that very few people submit tax returns in the UK, which then leads you to a situation where, given that most of the tax revenue take is through PAYE, you end up in a situation where you then have to start assigning tax credit and then claiming them back if you find that people have earned more than the requirement. I think we may have to look at all of that. I think we may have to look at the efficiency of all that, but I think it would make it much easier to have a comprehensive devolution and then to also add tax credits into the mix if we took a slightly different approach to analysing tax returns and perhaps have systems which allow individuals through PAYE also to deal with issues like tax credits. Most other countries do it. In most other countries, everybody has to file a tax return, simple as it is, and that then deals quite in an integrated way between in-work benefits and tax credits and taxes. And we may have to start looking at that as a possibility.
In other countries within the United Kingdom, there's already quite extensive devolution of welfare. In fact, Northern Ireland has ostensibly
Yes.
already had the maximum amount of devolution of welfare. Up until recently, for probably more political reasons than financial reasons, they have never differentiated between the rates of benefits and the services provided across to the rest of the United Kingdom. But when they did do it recently, it led to them requiring a loan effectively of £100 million, which now has to be paid back to the UK government. Is that the type of difficulty that we could end up with if we don't get the devolution of further welfare back in relation to the Smith Commission?
I think that sort of issue would seem to be more around what we were discussing earlier, which is around the fact that once you start devolving extensive powers, clearly maintaining revenue and spend in line is something which requires smoothing over time, and so you make a decision on benefits or taxes that might reduce your tax take. You then need to borrow or need to have access to a stabilisation fund to deal with that. I do think that if we're going to have a grown-up discussion which will devolve extensive powers to the Scottish Parliament, then we have to accept that there will be issues such as alignment of revenue, taxation and spend, which will never always be perfectly aligned, and there will need to be ways of handling that. But certainly, to come back to your key point, I think if you start devolving bits of benefits, parts of the benefit structure, not others, then you could end up in some unintended consequences. I think we need to look very carefully at the full structure of benefits, and I think it would make sense to then, a bit like income taxation, if you're going to devolve some of it, devolve as much as you can to avoid a large degree of overlap, which then leads to issues of competition on benefits.
Okay, that's helpful. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. John, to be followed by Jean.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, Professor. Building perhaps on some of the things that have already been said, because we talked earlier on, you said you'd been surprised in the sense that the public appetite had moved quite a lot in a relatively short time. And is the reality then that the public appetite or preference or whatever is just always going to be changing, and therefore there's no right answer to this, and we just have to kind of keep moving every 5 years or something? We have to kind of keep moving the rules or the arrangement to fit in with what people are wanting?
I do think there's been a very definitive switch towards a desire for greater fiscal powers. I think it's difficult to then go back, frankly. I think we're now in a situation where people seem to be wanting more fiscal powers, very different demands in terms of the nature of the public goods that will be offered in Scotland relative to the rest of the UK, which I suspect should lead us to having a situation where many more fiscal powers, as many more fiscal powers, I suppose, as is practical, without creating too much tax competition, should be devolved. I think it's difficult to then, turn the clock back and say, supposing in future the Scottish electorate's desire for public goods becomes more aligned with that in the UK, you will simply find that the tax rates will be aligned over time. The patterns of spending will become aligned. I do think that the movement will tend to be in that one direction, because we've generally seen federal states evolve over time and devolve powers. It tends to be towards more devolution, and tends to be greater centralisation doesn't always tend to follow after some time, because governments and parliaments will simply learn to use their powers in a way that match the desires of their electorate.
So should we be, do you think, trying to anticipate the desires of the electorate in the future, or should we just do a certain amount just now and then revisit it again, do you think?
I think we should end up with a rational structure which avoids too much overlap and too much competition. I mean, I'll give you one example. I mean, I think one of the issues when we came up with the proposals that were put into the Scotland Act is that it led to disputes over the whole calculation of the block grant. And I think this is the sort of thing we might want to avoid on this occasion. We might want to get into a situation where if we devolve X, Y, and Z in terms of taxes, we need to avoid a situation where we then start having rather difficult debates and rather sterile debates around areas of overlap, which is again why I suggested in this that perhaps we need to think a bit more laterally. I mean, towards at the very end of the paper, in fact, I say, well, supposing that the Smith Commission and the legislation that goes through ends up giving quite a lot more powers to the Scottish Parliament, devolving large areas of taxation, we may then need to look at ways and anticipating ways in which this might impact on our future issues through, for example, do we need an equalisation fund? Might there be appetite for that in the future? Because people do care about the different levels of provision of public goods around the UK. It clearly can't be the block grant as it's currently imagined. If supposing you end up in a situation where you have almost full fiscal autonomy, or where Scotland controls 80 to 100% of its spend through taxation, do we then want an equalisation fund of sorts in the UK?
Meaning between poorer parts and richer parts, that kind of thing.
Do we want something like that? Maybe not. Maybe yes. But I think the debate has to be had. That's the sort of discussion. So I think a lesson from what has happened before is that we should try and avoid unintended consequences. We should try and make decisions on devolving taxes which avoid halfway houses, which then lead to disputes. We should look very carefully at the whole interaction between the tax base and issues like the block grant, and avoid sort of potential conflict between jurisdictions in the future.
You raise a lot of points about that. I think we could spend a lot of time on some of these. I mean, I'm interested in the kind of equalisation idea, because you mention in your one paragraph towards the bottom, page 2, that other countries do it in different ways. You mentioned Australia and Germany putting quite an emphasis on equity, whereas Canada, USA and Switzerland seem to allow, are more relaxed about differences between the countries. I mean, are you just saying that's a debate we need to have rather than one is right and one is wrong? Yeah,
absolutely. That's the debate that we need to have, and I think it's an interesting debate. One could even, begin without fully specifying what that mechanism could be. One could, enshrine it as a principle that the two governments, the two parliaments, will have that discussion going forward. If there are major differentials, and let's not forget, it's not just about Scotland and the UK. I mean, there are pushes in Wales for greater devolution. Indeed in Northern Ireland, as has already been mentioned, and you could easily get into a situation where in future we may need some mechanisms that will address these issues. But I think it's a debate we have to have. There is no right answer. If there are very different desires between different levels of public goods spending and the range of public goods, then that argues for much more devolved taxation. Equalisation mechanisms become an issue if that is something that the electorates think is a major issue. And at the moment, it seems to be less central and less central to the current debate.
I mean, that would also raise the suggestion of within England, there's quite a lot of variation, obviously, and you mentioned the London economy and its different performance, and you also kind of link the, I think, the demand for devolution with uneven regional economic performance, which would apply in England, and yet there doesn't seem to be that demand for devolution in England.
Well, it's complicated, isn't it? Because there wasn't, at the time when the North East Regional Assembly was proposed, there wasn't, of course, a vote in favour. But to some extent, I mean, whenever I have discussions, and I don't know a huge amount about English devolution myself, but whenever I have discussions with people who do know quite a bit about it, they do say, well, one of the problems is that the way it was framed, that people in England do have desire for greater powers, but it tends to be much more associated with city regions than with regional areas that they feel very little association with. So I have to say, I mean, if you look at the data on the development of the UK over the last 20, 30 years, people worry a lot about inequality and uneven economic development. That is largely driven by the performance of London and the South East relative to the rest of the UK. I saw a very striking bit of evidence recently in a paper by David Bell and one of his co-authors, which showed that the drive towards inequality in the UK could be largely explained by what is happening in London and South East. And that sort of situation, you would expect that over time, the demand for greater devolution would grow even within England. And it might be framed around city regions than regional governments.
Okay, thank you. I mean, you've also mentioned, you used the word overlap a few times and halfway houses. And I mean, from what I'm getting from what you've said to other committee members, you quite like the idea that it's tidier and makes more sense if, like, the whole of a particular tax goes one way or goes the other. I mean, you also talk about devolving income tax completely, would introduce more complexity, but this is already managed within other countries which have multi-level income taxation. I mean, is income taxation then a little bit different in that it can be done at both levels, or do you still argue it was best done at one level?
I mean, it comes back to the point I made earlier, which is if we're serious about moving towards having most of the spend covered by taxation raised in Scotland, then you can't really do it without devolving pretty much all of income taxation. And indeed going beyond that, because you need to look at some other taxes, otherwise you can't get to the sort of numbers that people would want, which are in excess of what we would see through certainly even the Scotland Act, which would only raise it to 17%. So, and the other point I make is that if you split it, if you have a shared tax base, then you start getting potential disputes over that. And it seems to me cleaner in many respects if you avoid that on income taxation by saying income tax is fully devolved, it's devolved to the Scottish Parliament, you have full freedom of action over all elements of that, and that certainly takes care of a large proportion of the total spend of the Scottish Parliament. And indeed, it's not surprising that many of the proposals that have come forward from the political parties, and indeed IPPR or Reform Scotland actually say, you know, that's certainly the first one you would devolve, and then you would devolve it in its entirety.
I mean, national insurance is an interesting one. We've had quite a range of opinions on national insurance. I mean, you seem to take the line that it's effectively income tax and should be treated as such. We've had others who have been quite strong on the line that it's linked to benefits and welfare and should be seen as quite distinct from income tax. How would you respond to that?
I personally have changed my mind over time. I mean, initially, go back sort of 7-8 years ago, I also shared the view that it was different from income tax. But actually, when you look at the link between national insurance contribution and the actual amounts that's spent on benefits, it's pretty non-existent. And then the other thing which certainly makes me feel that it's really just something which is a tax on employment income, at least this is employee national insurance, is the fact that it then leads to this really bizarre pattern of marginal tax rates in the UK as you move from low pay to high pay, where we have much higher marginal tax rates actually somewhere in the middle of the distribution, which is slightly odd, to be honest. And occasionally, you see Chancellors of the Exchequer at the UK level saying, well, perhaps we can put an extra penny on national insurance across the whole range, and that takes care of another bit of spend. I really think it's very untidy, and if you want to make taxation more transparent, you should probably look over time to integrate the two. There's very little link in the amount that's raised through national insurance contributions by employees and the benefits that are offered.
I mean, I have to say that's personally the way I think as well, so I like that as an answer. I just wonder, you know, if you take 20p income tax and 10p national insurance, broadly speaking, and say, well, we'll abolish national insurance and have 30p income tax, I mean, do you think the public would react a wee bit against that?
I think the public might initially ask more questions, but I think what they care about is their pay packet at the end of the day. If it results in the same amount of take-home pay, I don't think they would care. They would very quickly understand it. In my view, public is actually quite rational once they start seeing how it impacts on them.
Okay, thank you. I mean, you also mentioned VAT, and that's been touched on already. It was just to clarify. You say that because of EU rules which makes VAT variation within the UK difficult. Now, we've had others that said it was impossible. Are you using difficult? Do you think it could be done?
I don't think it could be done. I mean, I think I think it would be difficult. But when I say difficult, impossible. I can't see the EU sort of agreeing to that sort of dual arrangements within the same state. I think there is a way around it, which is assignation. And I think that's the neatest solution, to be honest.
Witnesses who are argued very much against assignation because they felt we were taking on the risk but not having any of the control.
And I think that comes back to the discussion. I mean, for instance, and I think there needs to be the possibility, if Scotland gets the assignation, there needs to be a possibility for Scotland to have a dialogue with the UK government around the scope of VAT. As I say, VAT rates don't tend to change very much. We've seen them rise occasionally when at times of financial crisis, fiscal crisis, where you suddenly need to find a quick way of raising income. The thing that concerns me more there is whether the scope might change over time. So, for instance, you know, zero rated VAT at the moment. Items could they come within the scope in future? And I think if you have assignation, in some sense, the general public think, well, this is a tax which accrues to the Scottish Parliament. There needs to be a dialogue on issues like that because they are politically quite sensitive. The other issue might be if in future, we don't in this country, but in future whether we might think about making VAT more progressive. A number of countries have higher bans for luxury items, for instance. Now, again, some people see that as a good way of dealing with issues like inequality. Now, that is the sort of thing on which, if it's assignation, there should be a dialogue possible where, you know, the Scottish Parliament is able to say, well, we think this would be quite a good way to take to evolve VAT and for there to be a debate. Although ultimately the responsibility will, of course, rest with the UK Parliament.
Understanding that for VAT it's both the rate and the scope that would have to be centralised. It couldn't be any variation in either of these.
I would think so, yes. Absolutely, yes.
Okay, thanks so much.
Okay, thank you for that, John. It's Jean to be followed by Malcolm.
Thanks very much. And John has asked a couple of questions that I was going to ask, and I'm also pleased to hear your response on national insurance contribution, with which my view corresponds. But I wanted to ask everybody, I mean, all the kind of submissions talk absolutely about income tax, Professor Muscatelli, and as being the kind of basis for this discussion or the future of devolved taxes. But it's one of the most volatile as well. I mean, do you feel that there is any kind of security? You suggested earlier, I think, that any imbalance with that or negative would be for the Scottish Government then to use borrowing powers. Mm-hmm. But do you think that there should be, given that we're, I suspect, not going to have full fiscal autonomy and that there will still be some form of devolved budget from Westminster to Scotland, whether it's called a Barnett formula or not, would it be unacceptable to think that system would be used in order just to have some security for Scotland's income from tax, on income tax? Unless
you have full fiscal autonomy on current figures, you would need some element of block grant, absolutely, because otherwise it would put Scotland in a very difficult position, and it would be quite unfair. If you don't devolve all taxes, then by definition some taxes are reserved, and therefore Scotland would have to have access to that share through a block grant. I mean, I suppose then there's the question of how would you determine that block grant. At the moment, of course, because it's still such a large element, we've stuck with the Barnett formula because it's always been there. If you went to a situation where, supposing you devolved income taxation, supposing you devolved, say, oil and gas taxation, but you retained other taxes so that Scotland had control over a reasonable proportion, but not anything like full fiscal autonomy, then I think absolutely you'd need to look at how you use that block grant to make sure that you don't get too much instability in the resources available to the Parliament. And so, coming back to what I was saying earlier about should that then act as an equalisation grant? But secondly, I think, should it be more needs-based? You know, that's, at the moment, the Barnett formula is historic. Scotland has particular needs which are to do with its geography, which are to do with, rural communities. And again, it's not just Scotland. I mean, if Wales starts moving in this direction, should we not look at something which is more needs-based and more rational, given the taxes that have been devolved?
Thank you. What would you consider to be the most important economic, to quote, economic levers of power?
In terms of economic development and the possibility
Economic
of impacting,
growth.
yeah. I mean, certainly I think income taxation, corporation taxes, and including, and also employers' national insurance contributions, I would add to that, because again, a way of encouraging employment would be to say, well, we like to encourage inward investment by using that particular lever. And in the context of Scotland, of course, oil and gas taxation, because although it's less than it was, and there are uncertainties around future development, it is that very uncertainty which requires you to have some very clear levers and some encouragement for a sector that could still be hugely important for Scotland in terms of revenue.
And as far as the Smiths Commission is concerned, do you think that some form of security for the Scottish Parliament would be important, some kind of constitutional, written constitution for Scotland within that piece of work? That would mean that the Westminster Parliament, for example, couldn't abolish the Scottish Parliament, or that somehow will agree political differences.
So I'm not a constitutional lawyer. I was born in Italy, which has had a written constitution for a long time, and I like written constitutions. But I would have thought that, if there is a strong democratic will that it's important for the Scottish Parliament to be safeguarded, I cannot see why that is not the sort of thing that could come out of the Smith Commission process, and indeed, in terms of ensuring that we can't go backwards in terms of devolving responsibilities. That shouldn't be enshrined in what is currently the unwritten UK Constitution.
And finally, would you see that the ability for the Scottish Government to raise new taxes, as yet unthought of, perhaps to do with land, might be an example, would be something that should not affect any other adjustment in any form of block grant or anything else, that there would be an opportunity, there should be opportunities for Scotland to create new taxes which it could see itself growing perhaps in a different direction in some ways, but nevertheless would be independent in that respect?
I think absolutely right. I think if you take the position the current block grant is in some sense a payment which is a proxy for Scotland's share of revenues, of resources at UK level, then you shouldn't get into a situation where Scotland decides to start taxing in a particular area which is not currently taxed and also in the UK, you start reducing the block grant, because that I think that would be grossly unfair, to be honest. What you would probably want to do is to make that sort of discussion again a discussion for, where if Scotland decides to do it, it should have a dialogue with the rest of the UK, because, taxation practice and taxation innovation happens all the time, and it actually might be, it might be a great idea, it might be an environmental tax that might be of use to the rest of the UK, so there should be a dialogue, but I absolutely agree with your point that, there should not be an adjustment to the block grant.
And just finally, Convener, if I may, on on that basis, do you think that these conversations might be difficult, given that there could be political differences in terms of, for example, some people think that reducing tax is a way for economic growth. Others may see raising taxes as a way to economic growth.
I think that's right. To some, there are, of course, these conversations would be difficult. But again, I think if we are serious about creating a structure in the UK which is more devolved, which is close. I mean, I know the word federal is used, although that's a slight misnomer because, as I say in my paper, there's a lot of federal countries that actually are possibly less devolved. If you have a situation where you have substantial powers devolved to the Scottish Parliament, there needs to be a parity of esteem. There needs to be an ability for governments to say, look, we're in control of taxation for, say, 50, 60, 80, 100% of our revenues. It's important to have those dialogues, even though the decisions of the two parliaments may differ, to ensure that decisions aren't taken which have spillover effects on the other country. And I think it's about having a recognition that there's, within, between the two parliaments, there's a recognition of that interdependence and a desire to try and at least collaborate, even though, as you say, the thrust of the policies may be very different north and south of the border.
Thank you.
Thank you. Malcolm, to follow by Gavin.
You used the words fiscal autonomy in one of your recent answers, in fact, to Jean Urquhart. I suppose that could have two meanings. It could mean the kind of Devo Max fiscal autonomy, but it could also mean having enough taxation to cover whatever areas of policy are covered by a devolved Parliament. And you also talked about avoiding disputes over the block grant. So do you think it is either possible or desirable for this Parliament to have sufficient taxation powers to cover all the expenditure areas for which it's responsible?
I certainly think that's my view is that that's where public opinion has gone, that people do want to see that level of accountability, that you have pretty much full coverage of the total spend of the Scottish Parliament. And so, yes, I think that's the case. Again, I think that position has shifted very radically over the last few years. But if you don't, then, and if a large amount comes through the block grant, then you end up, again, potentially in a situation where the Scottish Parliament isn't fully accountable.
In your last series of answers, you did use the phrase block grant on more than one occasion. So, I mean, do you see the block grant as operating as currently, where it actually tops up? Although from your last answer, it suggests that you're using the term block grant more to mean an equalisation fund, or?
It depends on the amount. I mean, I think if the Smith Commission and the subsequent legislation suggests that, 50%, 40%, 50% of the total spending by the Scottish Parliament is covered by its own taxation, then I suspect that the block grant is not just an equalisation fund. It is really trying to make up also that real resource need through taxation which remains reserved. If you're starting to get towards 80, 90, 100%, then the block grant would simply be an equalisation fund if it still exists, and that would be then a matter of negotiation between the different governments saying, do we want to have a way of dealing with ebbs and flows and trends in GDP per capita across these islands or not? And so it depends on the amount.
It sounds as if you favour the latter approach.
I think I do. Well, simply because it's an observation. I think the public opinion is such that I think accountability has become the key issue, where previously I think people were more concerned about horizontal equity. I do think now that people, certainly in Scotland, believe that the Scottish Parliament should be responsible for raising the resources for the areas in which it spends.
So I suppose, the arguments against that are often used are, I suppose, well, in fact, your own paper talks about asymmetric macroeconomic shocks, so we could imagine perhaps an economic shock that affected Scotland more than the rest of the UK. So that could be one kind of risk, I suppose. Mm-hmm. And the other kind of risk, obviously, would be if one of the devolved taxes was in decline. I mean, oil is the one, obviously, that's most often quoted in that regard. And in fact, our witness last week, Jim Gallagher, actually said, devolve oil if you want to cut public expenditure in Scotland. So, I mean, what would be your view on that kind of critique of having, you know, equality between expenditure and taxation, that there wouldn't be provision for macroeconomic shocks or declining resources in one of the devolved taxes.
With accountability comes responsibility, and you know, the Scottish Parliament would need to recognise that there are certain taxes which, as I think was mentioned earlier, are more stable and others are more volatile. You need to have mechanisms to smooth that spending over time, and the mechanisms to do so through borrowing. You know, if one tax base was genuinely in decline over time, then it would be a responsibility of the Scottish Parliament to say we need to grow the economy and we need to grow other sectors in such a way that the tax base grows and allows us to meet the needs of in terms of public goods. I mean, I think I think there are ways of handling short-term macroeconomic shocks. I mentioned an oil stabilisation fund. I mentioned borrowing. If you think there are long-term trends in terms of some of these tax bases, well, oil and gas would be the only obvious one, then it's something that the Scottish Parliament would need to factor in and make sure that it can grow the economy in such a way through the levers it's then given to try and offset that over time. But it's not something that will happen instantaneously. It's something that would be, could happen over decades. So that's something that would be handled. It's less of a macroeconomic shock and more of an economic development trend.
And obviously, the more that's devolved, whether it's welfare or whatever, then the more tax has got to come if we're going to cover all that. I mean, I suppose just going back to corporation tax, to be honest, I didn't totally understand your explanation of differential rates linked to employment levels, but maybe I don't know if you want to try that again. But I suppose the other possibility for corporation tax would also be assignment. Would there be an argument for that in terms of?
Well, the problem with assignment is that you could assign corporation tax clearly, as you would assign a VAT. The big problem is you wouldn't then give Scotland the economic levers that it might feel that it wants in order to achieve that. And I mean, a lot of that was described quite well in the Hotham Commission report on Wales. I think it could be a very useful lever, particularly coming back to the earlier point, if you're trying to deal with secular changes in sectors, and if you want to, in Scotland's case, there might be a real interest to reindustrialise Scotland to ensure that it becomes increasingly competitive over time, then it's difficult to do that without the full range of economic levers, and corporation tax and employers' national insurance might be actually the sort of things that you need to create that impetus.
Well, obviously, we don't want to rerun the debate about corporation tax over the referendum, but I suppose one practical question would be, why would the rest of the UK, find it acceptable, to have, well, I suppose 2 points are, why would they find it acceptable for Scotland to have a lower rate of corporation tax? But secondly, I suppose again, we've had different evidence on this over the last few months, but how effective would that be anyway, and would that,
You're right that if we didn't take into account how it's calculated, then it could simply be brass plate operations. And we've seen that in jurisdictions like Switzerland, where different cantons, of course, have the ability to do that. And you then start getting simply profit transfers across different jurisdictions. If it was linked to real economic development variables, and I gave the example of the Hotham Commission and its argument around employment, then it's a bit more difficult to manipulate. The other way to do it, frankly, is through coordination, is to say, look, the governments should talk about these things, and one way to do it is to say you can vary it up to plus or minus X%. And when you put it in that way, I suspect, again, governments would get quite grown up about this and say, well, actually, Scotland has decided to have, say, 2 or 3p less in the corporation tax. Frankly, the impact on the rest of the UK is not huge, and we prefer to have a different balance. And that could lead to a more grown-up discussion around that and around different balances of taxation around the UK. I think we're just used to a system where people don't vary income taxes or indeed any other tax very much across the UK. But I think if you have a situation where more powers are devolved, you can have more grown-up debates about that, and also hopefully you might find that different choices will be made. I suspect they would be made.
So one final question. I mean, just going on to the assignment of VAT. I mean, in your paper you say it's a possibility, although I think in the course of questioning, I'm getting the impression you probably do support a degree of assignment of VAT. But you also say it doesn't change much over time. But I think in general there's been an upward movement of VAT, which is to some extent probably compensated for income tax, either remaining the same or going in the opposite direction. So most people who support assignment of VAT don't seem to have very strong arguments for it, but I may be totally wrong about this, but is there a problem if the UK government were to go down the route of further increases in VAT and reductions in income tax? Could that be catered for, or is that indeed catered for under the current block grant adjustment in terms of the income tax we're going to get, or would there have to be some provision to deal with that? Because otherwise the possibility would be that Scottish people would have they would have the high rates of VAT that the rest of the UK have, but they would also have to have a higher rate of income tax to maintain public expenditure in Scotland.
No, that's a fair point. I think if the block grant remains an element of the total package, and a tax like VAT is assigned, I think you certainly wouldn't want again adjustments in the block grant, which would doubly, there would be a double whammy for Scotland. I think that would be something that would need to be written in, whereby changes. If the UK government were to say move VAT to 22.5% or whatever, then Scotland should have the benefit from that, but it shouldn't then lose it in terms of its block grant. So, and these are the sort of complications I mentioned, that if you start having halfway houses with offsetting block grants, you need to put all these clauses in, because it could lead to real disputes between governments in future, and you've just highlighted one area where that could happen. Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Gavin?
Convener, thank you. Professor Muscatelli, you used the expression in your... I want to touch on borrowing powers first of all. You used the expression in your paper, appropriately extended borrowing powers. Now, obviously, there's going to be some link with which taxes are devolved as opposed to how much they ought to be extended. But, I mean, at a more fundamental level, are you arguing for a greater scope for borrowing regardless of which taxes are devolved, or are you saying that it should be linked very closely to which taxes are devolved?
I think it should be linked to the level of fiscal autonomy. If there's full fiscal autonomy, then you need much greater borrowing powers. That should be done in the context of whatever the fiscal rules are for the UK, because if macroeconomic policy is going to be reserved, then there needs to be some sort of fiscal pact which applies to the UK government as a whole, but then needs to translate into whatever is appropriate for Scotland. If Scotland had full fiscal autonomy, then, supposing in future the UK designs a deficit rule which is, plus or minus, 2% plus or minus, or whatever they might come up with, or a structural balance, then you need to have that translated in some way through agreement with the Scottish Parliament, because otherwise, and to some extent it needs to be designed on the basis of analysing the taxes that are devolved. So supposing you have a scenario instead where oil taxation and income taxes are devolved, you need to analyse how they move over time and what scope there would need to be for borrowing to offset sudden changes over the economic cycle.
Okay, thank you. The next question is about national insurance. When I read your paper, the impression I got was that you were keener on devolving employee national insurance as opposed to employer, but your sort of oral evidence is slightly different. I mean, can you just for the record, do you think you could devolve one without the other, or are you in favour of devolving both? Just clearly what your own view is.
You could separate the two. Employee national insurance is I think much more linked to personal taxation, although it's unemployment income. I think there are merits in devolving both. One, because the employee national insurance, because it's so integral to the structure of personal taxation. But employer national insurance, because it might be a very effective tool to deal with issues such as employment and economic development. And so I think there's merit in considering both for devolution, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
One issue that you touch on in your paper, but only briefly, and that hasn't really come up today so far, the various duties, whether that's fuel, alcohol, tobacco. What's your sort of personal view on whether or not and to what extent they ought to be devolved?
Devolving duties across a territory like the UK could lead to, tax avoidance simply by people, moving around, shopping around, and indeed illegal trafficking as well. I think this is a really interesting area because, of course, it is an area which overlaps into area of public policy. Different parts of the UK may have different views about the consumption of tobacco, the consumption of alcohol. I think there needs to be a debate about this. I think it is the area where you should try and avoid, again, too many complications, although, again, we see that in the US where they see different sales taxes and people shop across state lines. So it's not impossible to have it, but I think there needs to be a discussion. I think it largely depends if the Scottish Parliament would see these. They're less important in terms of a revenue source, although still substantial. If the Scottish Parliament feels it wants to have a substantially different policy towards these bads, if you like, tobacco and alcohol consumption, then there might be merit in looking at that and to have a discussion with the UK Parliament as to whether there might be some limits. But I think you want to avoid huge variations because otherwise you're going to have large-scale tax avoidance, trafficking, etc.
Okay, thank you. I think your answer, next is VAT assignment. I think your answer is probably implicit in what you've said already, but those who are in favour of it, some have said the entire portion should be assigned and others have said a percentage ought to be assigned. Do you have a view on whether it should be the entire portion or a fraction of it?
No, I don't have a strong view. I think it depends on the total package. If, for example, the feeling is that you should aim for 80% coverage of spend, then it could be seen as a residual element, but I don't have strong views. It seems to me that again, once the only reason why you might not want to assign all of it is if you want to use that as an equalisation fund. So, for instance, in Germany, in other jurisdictions, they do tend to have partial assignation as a way of saying, well, let's retain part of it and let's use that as the equalisation fund almost. So that would be the argument for partial assignment, but.
Okay, thank you. You've had a couple of questions on corporation tax. I want to just, I suppose, go a bit deeper into one of the answers you gave to Malcolm Chisholm. You said ultimately you could have I think what you described as a Holtum solution, and part of that might be intergovernmental cooperation where they agree, I guess, a broad framework. And I think you used the expression you could vary it up to plus and minus X%. I suppose my question is, it's quite an interesting idea, but my question would be, if X is a huge number, then various jurisdictions might rail against it. If X is a very small number, then you could argue that it might not be big enough to actually make any difference. And I just wondered, do you think, in theory you can say exactly what you said. In practice, or do you foresee a situation where X could be big enough to actually make an impact, but small enough that it doesn't cause disharmony amongst jurisdictions?
I think it could have an impact. I think even if X wasn't huge, or even if there was full devolution, but the Scottish Parliament only decided to exercise its powers at the margin to avoid having too big a disparity, I think it could have an impact. Even if you had, say, if X was 3%, you're talking about, if it's worked through a Holtum solution, you could think about employment costs being, 2 to 3% less in part of the UK. It might have an impact on a choice. For instance, if a company decides to locate in England, in the southeast of England, to locate instead in Scotland, it might be a sufficiently powerful economic lever, depending on how it's, of course, calculated and attributed. But I don't think it would be totally ineffective. But for the reasons we've discussed, I think there needs to be some sort of coordination mechanism to deal with it.
Grateful, thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Gavin. Well, that has concluded the questions from the committee. Professor Muscatell, I'm just wondering if there's any further points you wish to make.
No, thank you very much. I think we've covered most of the paper, so thank you again for inviting me.
Most of the paper? I thought we've been... I covered most of the paper, let alone the rest of the committee. Well, anyway, thank you very much, actually, for your evidence today. It's very much appreciated. I'll now allow a break until 11:25 till a changeover of witnesses. Thank you. Continue our consideration of further fiscal devolution by taking evidence from Professor Alan Trench and from Ben Thompson of the Campaign for Scottish Home Rule. Again, members have copies of the written evidence provided by our witnesses, so we'll go straight to questions. First question actually is to yourself, Ben. First of all, I would like to say 2 excellent submissions from you both, but first one is a copy of your letter to Lord Smith that we have. And in the very first sentence, you say the Campaign for Scottish Home Rule includes people from across the political spectrum and from out with politics who have come together to make the case for an effective, sustainable and productive home rule settlement for Scotland. So I'm just wondering if you can tell us what you mean by sustainable. Do you mean, for example, permanent?
I'm not sure anything is permanent if you go on long enough. I think sustainable means that you've set out what the destination is, clearly what Scottish Home Rule is. And to some extent, one of the problems that we've seen is that there seems to be a debate about certain taxes or welfare without necessarily setting it in a context of what Scottish Home Rule means and where you're going to. So the purpose of the campaign, first of all, was to say we need a set of principles that people can come together with to agree that that is the definition of Scottish Home Rule. And we've put forward our 3 principles, which are set out in the document, that sets out what we believe is behind Scottish Home Rule, which is really about giving Scotland control over domestic matters and matching the spending responsibilities with all the other tools around it needed to provide Scotland with the levers to deliver its domestic matters.
Thank you. And I should have said at the outset to Professor Trench that if I ask a question to Ben Thompson, you want to come in on anything, please feel free. And likewise, when I ask a question specifically to Professor Trench, Ben, if you want to comment, feel free to do so. Now, the areas you've obviously highlighted on 3 subsections: responsibilities devolved, raising what you spend, and mutual respect. And you basically say in the first line of responsibilities devolved that there should be a presumption in favour of devolving responsibility to Holyrood. But then you go on to actually include a 1 or 2 wee caveats. So, for example, you say that we would argue that this would include substantial welfare powers. Can you give us a wee bit of clarification? Are you basically saying that powers should be devolved to Holyrood and then, if you like, almost handed back to Westminster? Because that's almost the way I'm interpreting that. And if that is the case, why are you calling for substantial welfare powers rather than welfare powers? I mean, could you define that a wee bit more, what you mean by that?
I come, actually, funnily enough, I was just reading a rather good article by Dave Watson of Unison, who sets this out rather well, and it's the principle of subsidiarity. What it's saying is that Westminster, there are obviously very clearly some UK powers that are to do with the UK, but if you have a grey area, it's up to Westminster to justify why those powers should be reserved to Westminster. So that's the first point in subsidiarity, is that it should be Westminster to say, look, these powers are for UK matters, and therefore they belong to Westminster. As you know, there are about 70 areas of powers that are currently reserved at Westminster. We feel, looking down those, that there are a number of powers that actually the outcome should be delivered by Holyrood. The outcome is delivered by Holyrood, but the powers have remained at Westminster. So an obvious one for that would be housing, where the outcome for the provision of housing is actually a local matter, but certainly a Scottish matter, whereas the welfare component of it resides with the UK. So that's an obvious thing to push down. We've identified that just on the existing outcomes that should be delivered by Holyrood, there are about 6.5 billion of the current welfare budget of 14.4 billion, excluding pensions, that would absolutely fall within this category of being passed down. But it doesn't just mean welfare. There are things like transport, there are things like employment law, where the outcome needs to be delivered at a Scottish level, but some of the powers have been reserved by Westminster. And what we're just saying in the principle of subsidiarity is that Westminster needs to justify why those powers are reserved. And if those powers, actually the outcome for delivery of them lies at Holyrood, we would suggest that those powers should be devolved down.
Okay, thank you. And I mean, you're arguing effectively that because of the current situation, policy can end up being, and I quote, unfocused and inefficient. And you talk about, and again I quote you here, saying, regardless of the merits of these programmes, the ability of Holyrood to address the problem of poverty and inequality is seriously hampered because the main levers by which to address it held by Westminster. The Scottish Government can do little more than tinker around the edges. I wonder if you can give us a couple of examples of that.
Well, a classic one of that would be Labour. I mean, if you think of an outcome for Scotland is getting people back into jobs, then surely Scotland should have the full range of tools to enable people to get back into jobs, and that includes, how that Scotland relates to the voluntary sector, and that involves some employment law in that. It involves job seekers allowance. So it's trying to say, and that's one instance of the outcome should be delivered by Scotland. Let's get all the tools that Scotland needs to deliver that in one place. You've asked me for a couple, so I'll give you another one. Housing. Why should housing be a local government matter, principally, and yet some of the tools for it lie at a Westminster level, such as housing benefit or fuel benefit? Actually, if you want to come up with holistic solutions to solving some of these problems, you need all the tools in one place. So, for instance, if you were a local government and you wanted to do a heating scheme in a different way and provide heating through community heating, then you shouldn't be hamstrung by the fact that fuel allowance is set at a Westminster level. You should be able to do something in a much more holistic way with all the tools that you have to deliver the outcome, which is that people should have access to housing.
Okay, thank you for that. Professor Trench, have you got any comments you want to make on what's been said so far?
I have to say I'm somewhat uneasy about this as a general approach, because I don't think that time really permits at this point to go into some sort of rather distant discussion of general principles about putting all the tools in the hands of the Scottish Parliament to address particular sorts of problems. What's needed at this point is to be able to be quite specific and detailed about what should and should not be devolved. The discussion about the area levels of principle is, given the timescale that's now applying following the referendum, one that frankly belongs months and months ago. And what we have tried to do through the Devo Moore work, which I've talked to you about in our previous meeting in June, was to go through some of that detail and say these are things that can and should be devolved. These are things that cannot or should not, or cannot and should not. And I'm afraid I think at this stage what you need is that level of detail rather than something loftier. If I might say something about what Mr. Thompson has just said regarding devolved powers, I think there's also a question then of a need to think through in a rather different way the implications of the outcome of the referendum. I wouldn't have any objection whatever to seeing things that relate to fuel issues and heating being substantially devolved. We argued in our Devo Moore and welfare paper for the devolution of housing benefit. And it's quite obvious that in the housing context that's a devolved function, and that all the levers should go with it. And there are some very strong policy reasons for the UK government to want to do that, not merely to address, as it were, a Scottish grievance or a Scottish request or demand, but actually positively to improve policy outcomes. I think when you're talking about the labour market, that's something very different, because there you're actually talking about a range of instruments that relate to the UK economy as a whole. And I would regard the outcome of the referendum as saying we are to preserve the UK economy. And so putting up barriers to that economy by devolving things like employment law and job seekers allowance, which also then relates to the idea of a social union, actually seem to me to run contrary to that principle.
Okay, so
Can I come back on that?
I'm just going to let you back in a wee minute, but I just want to make another point with Professor Trench, and I'll let you come in on both of these, Ben. I'm sure things will heat up. Professor Trench, the Scottish Home Rule paper says, and I quote, we believe that the principle of raising what is spent is more important than the specific taxes which are initially devolved. Is that something you would agree with?
No, it's not. I think you will struggle to find places where that principle does apply. The one exception is, of course, the Basque Country. The Basque Country is perhaps a more complex place than is often considered. I don't think it's simply practicable within the constraints of the UK tax system. And the funding Devo Moore paper ran through a number of the reasons why that's so. When you start to look at the specific taxes that you would devolve, you simply can't get to a figure that equates to 100% of Scottish Parliament spend without causing some very, very serious fiscal distortions or spillovers. And I think, again, if we go back to the implications of the referendum is an endorsement of staying in the United Kingdom. And the principle of the United Kingdom is that there is an expression of solidarity across the United Kingdom, which includes inter alia funding some services by grant, which ensures that there's equal access, or at least it tries to ensure the principle of equal access to a similar range of public services for people no matter where they live. And it's then a matter for devolved governments to choose what those services are and indeed whether, in fact, it's going to offer that package of services.
I'm afraid to say that I totally disagree about specifics. I mean, Devo Plus had specifics. There are lots of people who deal with specifics. I think it's completely horse before the cart. Unless you can actually set out where we're going to this and what these powers are going to be used and win the public over on that, the specifics is just a horse trade. Unless you can get across why we're doing this, then actually the specifics are irrelevant. And the reason that we're trying to set out principles is that it is the principles that the public can then understand why are we doing all of these taxation or welfare or changes. And there's a real belief that if we don't have a set of principles underlying this, all that will happen is we'll never put this to bed. We'll never actually get a satisfactory home rule because no one will actually understand where it is we want to go to. And each year we will continue to have another argument about which specifics should be there because no one actually knows where it's going. So what we're trying to do first is set out a destination. Might take some time to get there, and then look at the specifics. We've set out a lot of specifics in the past. As you know, I chaired the Devo Plus group. As a technical point, the Basque Country is not what we're proposing. They don't raise what they spend. That's full fiscal autonomy.
That wasn't a point to address to you, but addressed to the committee.
Sorry, but I'm just,
I'm aware that's not what you're proposing.
I'd just like to say that is not raise what you spend. Raise what you spend is each level of government. Hopefully, in the end, Westminster, Holyrood, and local government should raise the money that they spend. And the reason for that is that we believe that makes people really accountable and to the public that they serve, and also gives them the holistic tools to produce the outcome that they're expected. If the outcome from Holyrood is to do things like getting people back into jobs and poverty alleviation and housing, then they should be given the tools to actually do the job. And I would argue exactly the same for Westminster and the same for local government. It's a similar philosophy through. When it comes to specifics, we can give just as many detailed specifics in the research that we've done as Devo Moore. But Devo Moore can't tell you what the ultimate destination is. It just says, here are some useful more powers that come down. We're trying to put that into a framework and to a context. So I disagree that the specifics are the important part. I think the principles are the first step, and then the specifics come after that.
Can you come back in?
Yes, and with respect, one small point, Chair, which is that Devo Moore is as clear as we can be about the destination, given that it's not for that project to define what the destination is. But that project has sought to establish what it is that you would need to do if you were to start from where we are today in order to run a more devolved United Kingdom. And those are the parameters, it seems to me, that come out of the referendum. So we claim credit for being wise before the event.
Thank you. And now, The Home Rule paper says that both Westminster and Holyrood should have the powers to change, create or abolish taxes for which they are responsible. Is that something you would agree with, Alan?
I think, broadly speaking, yes. I think that is the nature of devolving a tax, that it becomes a devolved matter, and that you're then able to make all the decisions relating to that. And we've seen that in a very micro way in relation to what were stamp duty, land tax and landfill tax at UK level that are being devolved as of April. And which are being replaced by different taxes in Scotland. That seems to me to be exactly what one would expect to occur if taxes are devolved. And part of the point of fiscal devolution is to enable you to use those taxes that are devolved as levers and to exercise full autonomy within that sphere.
So if income tax was to be devolved, do you believe that Holyrood should have control over rates, bands and thresholds?
That's what we said.
Right. Okay, excellent. Ben? Anything?
Well, maybe there's a question more for...
with a couple of limited caveats, but certainly rates, bands and thresholds, you need to have a common UK definition of income for the purpose of income tax in order to make it work. And I think you would need to preserve exemptions in relation to pensions entitlements across the UK as a whole. But beyond that, yes.
I'll ask you about why that should be in a minute, but Ben?
I mean, maybe this is not a question to yourself, Chairman, but to Alan, just on his scheme. If you're allowed to create, change, or remove taxation, but you're not have a framework for what you're responsible for, well, what's the underlying principle behind it? We're saying that the principle is you raise what you spend. So within that, if you decide to remove one of the taxes that you have and replace it with another, you know that the overall framework is you've got a £38 billion budget, or whatever it ends up being if you transfer some welfare down, and your responsibility is to raise the money that you spend. If it's just about specifics, then if you want to remove taxes or change taxes, then what is the level you're trying to reach? If you've got no destination, you are struggling to do things in the dark, and all it'll end up being is a constant negotiation with Treasury and Treasury models about whether removing a tax in terms of specific does something but with no destination or principle behind it. So that's the problem that we see, is that unless you have a set of principles, actually it doesn't work going forward because you don't know what you're doing with these taxes.
Okay, Alan, can you comment on the caveat with
all I would point out is there's a 25-page discussion in the Funding Devo Moore paper of the principles that relate to taxation within federal and decentralised states.
Okay. And just one final point with regard to your paper, before I move on to Alan's paper, Ben, is you've already touched on it a wee bit when you say, and talk about further devolution from Holyrood. When greater powers are devolved to Scotland, the Scottish Government should seriously consider devolving some of these new powers as well as some of its existing powers to local authorities, such as?
Well, I think the same principle applies. If let's say one of the outcomes that Alan's mentioned about is housing, if that's a local government level, then actually local government Holyrood should look to devolve on exactly the same principle those powers down, because local government should have the tools to be able to deliver the outcome. So actually, if it's local government that's responsible for providing homes for people, then all of those tools should be passed down to local government, because that's an outcome that they have to deliver. So that's one example, and we see no reason why the philosophy of this shouldn't actually be adopted at a local government level as well as a Holyrood level.
And I take it, obviously, if local government was to raise all the taxes it spent, there'd be a significant increase in local government taxation. Now, obviously, that would have to be compensated for by a reduction in taxation from a Holyrood level, if you want to put it that. Is that something you would be suggesting?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's a certain slice of the pie. As you already know, we've gone on record to say that we don't think that council tax caps should have been instigated by Holyrood. We think that council tax should be devolved properly to local government. We think that business rates should be set at local government, that local government should look at raising more of what they spend, and that in terms of providing outcomes, if local government is responsible for, let's say, local protection, you shouldn't centralise the police force, and we've already set all of those things out to say that you try and match the outcomes at each level of government with the respective powers.
These things are great in theory, but I mean, if you look at areas in, say, the west of Scotland, you know, surrounding Glasgow, you know, there's people go into Glasgow to shop, you know, they don't. The rates revenue from somewhere, you know, some of the peripheral local authorities to Glasgow or indeed Edinburgh would be significantly lower than they would be in Glasgow itself. So surely that would just mean, you know, the kind of transfer of resources which you have at present.
I don't think it does. It enables different areas to compete in different ways and provide what's best for their local area. So actually having differences is not a bad thing, it's a good thing. It enables people to play to their strengths. So I don't see it as a problem in the same way that different areas have different business grants or for encouraging businesses in. So I really don't see the problem of having different council tax or different rates. In the same way I don't see the problem that Scotland has different income taxes to Wales or Northern Ireland, which would be exactly the same argument at a Scottish government level.
Okay. Let's switch to Alan's paper, actually, which is let's look at the impact of further tax devolution on the block grant. You say that two problems arise from the proposed continuation of the current arrangements for the block grant as part of the package of further fiscal devolution. First is the question of the discretion this gives to HM Treasury. And you've got four quite interesting subsections to that, which I'm going to ask you to expand on. And for example, in paragraph D, you talk about in the event of a disagreement, all that happens is that the issue would be referred to a UK minister who will seek to mediate the disagreement, and if HM Treasurer refuses to change its position, there's nothing the devolved administrations involved can do about it. I mean, does this not significantly undermine devolution itself, and should this be changed?
I would entirely agree it should. The dispute resolution protocol, as it was originally called, was instigated by the SNP government when it was a minority and incorporated into the Memorandum of Understanding in 2010. There hadn't been anything in there to deal with this issue before then, and I would strongly suspect that this was something on which there was agreement with the other devolved administrations as well, but a limit to what they could persuade the UK government to agree. And so there's a good deal of rhetoric in that protocol about seeking to avoid disputes and clear negotiations, and much of which had already appeared in the Memorandum of Understanding. And then there is this procedure which provides for the panel of a UK minister who has not previously been involved in the issue to be convened. Now, as it happens, I understand when the 2012 London Olympics was referred, and that's the only issue that's actually gone to this panel. Partly because I suspect devolved governments now will be of the view that it's a very limited use. That they found themselves shoehorned into the diary of Francis Maude, who was the Cabinet Office Minister. So they, as it were, a spare minister was found who had not been involved, who in a sense was neutral between the parties because the dispute was regarded as being between the devolved administrations and HM Treasury, and so a Cabinet Office Minister was in that sense neutral. It was shoehorned into his diary for an hour at 8:30 in the morning. And that doesn't strike me as a particularly serious attempt to resolve a significant and long-standing issue which involved several hundred millions of pounds, as well as a significant issue of principle about the Treasury's ability to revise and rewrite the Memorandum of Understanding, which is what had triggered the issue in the first place. And I think that something more robust is needed, has been really for quite a long time, but is certainly needed now, and the problems of this are clearly exposed.
Yes, I mean, you go on to talk about how there needs to be extensive reform of the administrative arrangements for the block grant, and you talk about an independent impartial figure or body to mediate in the event of agreements. Have you got anything specific in mind for that?
Well, I think that this is something that in a sense needs to be resolved between the parties, but there has to be some attempt to find figures from out with the governments involved. Now, whether that is, as it were, distinguished grandees in other contexts, not perhaps a very comfortable parallel, but in Northern Ireland, there's been a recourse to particularly judges from parts of the Commonwealth to help deal with some of the more complicated issues that have arisen. I don't think that there's any need for anyone from outside the United Kingdom in this sort of a context, but there certainly does need to be something that goes beyond ministers in the governments involved being judge and jury in their own cause.
Yes, I mean, you know there's been issues with regard to the devolved taxes vis-à-vis the block grant adjustment.
Indeed,
section.
I was slightly bemused when I'm preparing for this meeting to see the correspondence you've had and that this issue has remained outstanding for such a very long time.
Yeah, is that something that you think is likely to be a continued source of friction in the months ahead if further taxes are devolved?
Well, they shouldn't be. If one goes back to the 2010 command paper that set out the model of fiscal devolution that's currently being implemented through the Scotland Act 2012, it proposed a much messier mechanism for income tax devolution than for the two smaller taxes. And perhaps it was uncautiously simplistic in the approach that it recommended to the two smaller taxes. And there's therefore been an attempt by the UK government to try and resile from a position that it perhaps slightly incautiously adopted then. Ironically, I think the approach that's been agreed, at least at the level of principle, for the block grant with income tax devolution is much more robust. The proportionate the index deduction approach, as recommended in a Welsh context by the Holtham Commission, I think is much more robust, and it's notable that one of the many advantages that offers is that it means that what otherwise would have been a very complicated application of the no detriment principle that was proposed as part of that command paper will play a much more limited role, because the change in the UK income tax base will reflect the change in the changes in things like personal allowances, rather than needing to engage in a complex and messy brokerage to try and negotiation to try and resolve those issues.
Okay, I'm going to let Ben in a minute, but you've said in paragraph 8, and the last sentence you say, whether such a system is in fact sustainable or durable in the longer term is open to question. In Chapter 6 of Funding Devo More, I suggest an alternative approach. I'm just wondering if you can touch on that for us.
Well, I think in the shorter term, what we will need to do is to look to improving the machinery that surrounds the operation of the block grant as it currently stands, and to deal with the fact that essentially our financing system depends on a very informal Treasury document that Treasury drafts on its own. And that there needs to be greater devolved formal engagement and approval of the Statement of Funding Policy and of its composition, uncomfortable as that will be for the UK government. And I think if the administration is improved, it will make it easier then to look at other areas of reform. What we recommended in Funding Devo More was an approach that would produce an overall envelope for devolved services on the basis of relative need, and discount from that for the fiscal capacity in relation to devolved taxation. And that's an overall approach that would apply no matter what tax bases you were in fact to devolve. The idea of using fiscal capacity in that sort of context is a very common one in federal systems. In some, like Canada and Switzerland, it is the sole basis of equalisation systems. In others, it's one of a number of components. But it would still, in a country like Australia, that, as Professor Muscatelli said earlier, is relatively equity-oriented as federal systems go, it still accounts for about 2/3 of the changes in the spending formula, in the allocation formula that's operated by the Commonwealth Grants Commission. You would necessarily, given the current levels of spending, need to introduce that relatively slowly. A change like that would be appreciably to Scotland's advantage compared to a pure fiscal equalisation approach, because your fiscal capacity, when I last looked at the numbers, overall was about 98-99% of the UK per capita average, and relative need comes out at about 105%. So there is an obvious advantage in aiming for an overall envelope that's addressed to relative need. And again, that would need to come in over a period of time. It's not the sort of thing that one could or should introduce relatively quickly.
Thank you. Ben?
I come back to the first point, which is, unless you have a clear set of principles, you will be reliant on negotiations with the Treasury. And I think to date, one has to well, history would tell us that negotiations with the Treasury is a dark art that is very obtuse and difficult to understand. Just to sort of add some flesh onto that, let's take something like assigned revenues. Assigned revenues going forward will rely on a Treasury model to determine how much is going to actually be benefiting the assignment of the revenues and splitting it all up. So the actions that you take, if you're getting that back in from assigned revenues, will be largely due to the Treasury models coming up with the figures that you will then get allocated. That is a real dark art in terms of negotiation and will set governments in conflict to some extent about how the impact of something is going to have on your revenue. So all of these things, I think, actually add to the complication and could add to the friction between the governments. Whereas if you have a clear set of principles and you understand what you're doing, actually it means that you don't have to rely on some of this complication that Alan is dealing with. I come back to our principles. If you have, if you're clearly responsible for raising what you spend, you don't have to then rely on Treasury determining what your revenue levels are.
Yeah, yes, one of Alan's professorial colleagues actually talked about Treasury gaming in one of his submissions and in giving evidence. Now, I'm just going to ask one further question because colleagues are obviously keen to come in, and that's, Ben, it's about Alan's paper. Alan says in paragraph 11 of his paper that since HM Revenue and Customs appears to proceed on the basis that the full marginal cost of devolved tax collection should be borne by devolved administrations, it's hard to see if there's any argument that it should not be fully open to scrutiny by the Parliament or bodies the Parliament designates for those charges. I take it you fully agree with that statement?
That we should be able to have full scrutiny. Yes. Absolutely. Clarity of information, so that one should be able to see very clearly the figures from both across the UK and within Scotland.
Okay. Any further comment you want to make on that aspect? No. Oh, okay, that's fine. Well, thank you very much. We will now go to the open session, and it will be Jamie to be followed by Malcolm.
Thank you, Convener. Gentleman Professor Muscatelli, when he was here, said that where there is divergent political priorities between different jurisdictions within the state or a single state, a highly devolved system is more desirable. Do you agree?
Well, I've just said that the principle of subsidiarity is totally in agreement with that, in which the higher level of government has to justify why it is it needs those powers to do it on a UK basis, and therefore everything else should be pushed down to devolved government, both at Holyrood and, again, the principle we think should be both from Holyrood and down to local government. So I do agree.
I think I would agree with the broad principle. I'm not quite sure what it would necessarily mean in practice. Because the question of what amounts to a large amount of fiscal devolution is something that varies from system to system. Now, what we have in the case of Scotland is a government that is responsible at the moment for about 65 to 70% of public spending, of total public spending that takes place within Scotland. The bulk of the exception, of course, being social security spending. And that certainly already puts Scotland at the upper end of constituent units in federal and decentralised systems around the world. What, of course, Scotland is not doing is raising any significant proportion of that. And the aim of the recommendations that are enacted through the Calman Commission, also through the Scotland Act 2012, is to push that figure up from where it currently stands, which I think is around, on the basis of local taxation, is around 14 or 15% to around 30%. And we will see if it actually accomplishes that. I suspect it won't, and part of the reason for that, slightly paradoxically, is because of the council tax freeze. So the Scottish Government has deliberately chosen as a matter of public policy to reduce one source of revenue in order to achieve certain policy outcomes. And there is then the constraint of what you can actually do within the UK tax system. And as I think I said to you the last time I gave evidence, the UK is characterised by a very, very centralised tax system. Indeed, the more I look at this, the more I come to the conclusion, that seems to be the point of the United Kingdom. It was built around a very centralised tax system going back to the 18th and even the 17th century. So moving away from that is no small undertaking. It's not a reason to say it shouldn't be done, but it's not easy to do.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. In your paper, Professor Trench, I'm going to try and composite two questions into one because we're up against the questions. In your paper, Professor Trench, you talk about the Scotland Act 2012 and the fact that new taxes could be arise out of that, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But in your paper, Ben, you would, and the conveners talked about this, the idea of substantial welfare powers coming to this Parliament. So in a similar fashion to the possibility of new taxes being created, do you think that these substantial welfare powers should allow for the Scottish Parliament to create new forms of benefit that might not even have been thought of thus far? And coming back to your paper, Professor Trench, you're quite critical. Well, I think you're critical. Maybe you're not critical. Maybe you're just setting out as fact that the criteria set out in the command paper, whereby new taxes require HM Treasury approval. You describe this as implying a view that new taxes should not be introduced, rather this is a matter first and foremost for the Scottish Parliament. So is that a satisfactory state of affairs? So you can both comment on both issues in terms of new taxes and new forms of benefit. I don't know who wants to go first.
Shall I go first? Happy. Well, as far as welfare benefits are concerned, the answer is yes. We said so very plainly in the Devo Moore and welfare paper. The Scottish Parliament, as part of the idea of a supplementing power, the Scottish Parliament should be free to introduce new welfare benefits if it wishes, and provided it can find the resources to do so. As regards new taxation, I was interested to hear Mazurkat's questions about this to Professor Muscatelli as well. Those criteria struck me as being both vague and negative when I read the command paper, which admittedly was a little while ago. And I think that's disappointing given the importance of that power. And I think that power to introduce new forms of taxation is really very important, not merely because this is a way for the Scottish Parliament possibly to raise additional revenue, but it's also a way for it to shape behaviour. And perhaps also to obtain revenues from activities that have been encouraged by other means. So that strikes me as being something that actually ought to be looked at quite positively, not least because it's part of what devolution, fiscal devolution will mean is a different fiscal mix in the different parts of the UK. One would not expect all the parts of the UK to have the same taxes, even if the rates vary. They will tax different things in different ways. And that's what the point. That's the point of the exercise. So I would hope that those criteria would be clarified in the course of the coming months. I think that UK government would be well advised to look at them again and to clarify them, and to cast them in both clearer and more positive terms, so that involved governments have a greater degree of certainty what taxes are likely to satisfy those criteria and what aren't.
Come to you, Ben, just on that point though. Failing that, do you think this whole Smith Commission process and the process of further devolution should make a recommendation in this regard?
I think it would be helpful if they did.
Okay, thank you.
So, first, stepping back a little bit, as we see it, the outcome for Scotland is that Scotland should be responsible for all the sort of political and welfare levers, along with the spending powers, for domestic matters in Scotland. So, and in order to do that, yes, if you devolve these powers down, then Scotland should have the full control over the welfare powers and the tax powers to deliver the outcomes that it's meant to do. So, we would totally support that when a welfare power was passed down or a tax was passed down, that the Scottish Government would then have the ability to change that, would have the ability to get rid of it, or to create new taxes or welfare powers. That is what is having full fiscal levers. It's why we're so very against assigned revenues, because assigned revenues give you no no levers at all in being able to influence and change policy, because all you're doing is getting a share. It's another form of Barnett formula, if you like, coming down from Westminster. So we don't see assigned revenues as being any form of devolution at all. If you actually look at the different party proposals, under the Scotland Act, only 22% of Scotland's current budget at 38 billion will be covered by taxes that Scotland raise. If you look at the three proposals from Labour, the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives that they put forward before the referendum, then under Labour that would go up to 26%, under the Conservatives it would go up to 37%, and under Liberal Democrats that would go up to 41%. I have excluded assigned revenues because we don't believe that they are devolved at all. We don't believe that simply represents any sort of matching between fiscal responsibility and spending responsibility, and therefore that's why we've got this very, very clear statement. I agree totally with Alan that if this does go ahead, we will see different mixes of taxes, and the main industries in Scotland are not the main industries in other parts of the UK. So whereas we rely heavily on things like tourism, the financial services sector, whiskey industry, oil and gas, we can actually construct contracts and taxes around supporting those particular industries. We're not particularly interested in major international non-DOM, so things like non-DOM taxes aren't particularly relevant to us. So we can actually focus on creating a package in taxation that will actually benefit our economy and help Scotland's economy to grow, which is part of the outcome of what Holyrood's supposed to do. So I very much agree with the different mix of taxes, and in answer to your point, I think that both welfare and taxation, once devolved in those areas, we should, in the Holyrood Parliament, have full powers to change, create new ones, and get rid of taxes to meet the outcomes that we're trying to achieve.
If I might just pick up one point. I noticed Mr Thompson refers to the 22% figure for revenues, the proportion of Scottish Parliament spending raised through the Scotland Act 2012 package. And that's a figure that I think he is deriving from the recent paper from the Scottish Government, More Powers for the Scottish Parliament, and which, on the face of it, is backed up by some of the numbers in GERS 2012-13. I really rather doubt that figure. I strongly suspect that there is some double counting going on within that, and I'll be writing, if I may, Chair Convener, regarding that in due course, because I think that figure is somewhat misleading.
Higher or lower?
I think the proportion is appreciably higher.
I mean,
there's double counting on the expenditure side that appears not to be taken account of in the figures that are used to assess Scottish Parliament spending in the GERS data.
Very happy to give you the figures, Chairman. It's Scottish public sector expenditure 2012-13, as reported by the Scottish Government in GERS.
Yes, the point is that there's double counting in that figure.
38,546,000,000, and the income raised, as estimated from 2012-13 in the Scotland Act's powers, will be 8.669. So that's where the source
I have to accept any kind of clarification and double check any of these figures.
As I say, the point is there's some double counting in that figure, and the mistake is made in taking that figure at face value rather than understanding exactly what it does and doesn't include.
Thank you for that. Jamie, ball's still at your feet.
Well, I'm very delighted with that. I mean, I should say, gentlemen, it's very interesting, somewhat theoretical. Just going to have to say the exact proportion of what the Parliament raises out of the Scotland Act 2012 isn't exactly the talk of the steamy out there. It's not been raised with Labour many constituents. I should say just one.
That sounds like a sad comment on the decline of Scottish public debate since the referendum campaign.
Well, it was a comment on something, Professor Trench. I'll leave others to conclude what it might have been. But just finishing with your paper, Professor Trench, you argue that in the event of further substantial taxation devolution, that HMRC should be the primary collection agency, and I was a bit perplexed why you felt that Revenue Scotland taking on that role would increase the burden on taxpayers and reduce the effectiveness of tax collection. I mean, especially given that thus far, one of the reasons, and we explored this with Professor Muscatelli, one of the reasons that Revenue Scotland was in fact established was when the Scottish Government explored the possibility of HMRC collecting the tax that had been devolved. Actually, it wasn't more cost effective, it was going to cost more. It was actually more cost effective to create and charge Revenue Scotland with that task.
I'm sure that's the case in relation to landfill tax and stamp duty land tax or land and buildings transaction tax, and I'm sure your committee's done far more work on that. In relation to income tax, I was interested listening to Professor Muscatelli and his discussion of possibly the need for everyone to submit tax returns. Now, where we are at the moment is a situation that creates something of a dilemma. In most of the developed world, the submission of a tax return is something that everybody has to do at the end of the year, even if in reality all their taxes have been paid. When I lived in the United States, submitting a tax return was something one had to do. It was an annual chore, even though my US income was very straightforward. And one had to sit down, make sure one had got it right, send it off. And in my particular case, I then received a cheque back from the Internal Revenue Service. In a UK context, we have, of course, the PAYE system, pay as you earn. And PAYE, if you look at it comparatively, is actually a quite wondrous thing. It makes tax compliance on the part of taxpayers amazingly simple and amazingly straightforward, because most of them don't fill out tax returns. And it therefore saves taxpayers a lot of time and inconvenience. It saves tax, it provides for a very high rate of tax collection. So the public revenues receive a very high proportion of what they are entitled to. And that rate appears to fall off by about 10 points once you have systems that are based on submission of tax returns. Certainly, when you compare self-assessment taxpayers with PAYE taxpayers, the rate of payment is somewhere between around 85% as opposed to 95%. And it's much, much cheaper and simpler for the tax collection agency. Now, could Revenue Scotland operate a PAYE system that dovetailed with HMRCs in relation to Scottish taxpayers? Would be, I think, the question you would want to ask. And that, I think, depends on a number of things, including the extent of income tax devolution that goes on, how that interacts with non-devolved taxes, for example, capital gains tax. I mean, not many people pay it. It's not a very large amount of revenue. But it's something that needs to be accounted for and is accounted for through the income tax system. And how would you manage the interplay or the interrelationship between people who change their tax residence from one year to another, who count as Scottish taxpayers in one year but not as Scottish taxpayers in the next, or vice versa? And how do you make sure that you've got control of the information to provide at least some check on the accuracy of the information they're providing? Those are the considerations on an operational level. And I think that those are the reasons why there are some very strong arguments for HMRC to continue to operate as a tax collection agency. And I note that in many federal systems, actually, you end up with a central state agency that carries on doing these things. I'm always struck, particularly in Canada, at the extent to which tax collection remains in the hands of the federal government, except in Quebec. And certainly in English-speaking Canada, the line that I often hear when I ask people about this is, well, on the one hand, this is what the federal government does to make life easy for Canadians. So that's the line from the federal government. And the line more generally, not just from the federal government, people in the federal government, but also other people involved in the tax system is, well, that seems to be Quebec making life difficult for Quebecers to make a nationalist point. And that, I think, is the consideration that would apply if you were to want to have a different tax collection agency for income tax in Scotland.
I think there's a huge opportunity in devolving the collection of tax. I think the opportunity could be for both providing a better service. I agree that PAYE has worked quite well, but the services around and people filling in their tax returns is not particularly good. HMRC has the lowest feedback of any of the government departments in terms of staff morale, and that's an indication of how the organisation is run. I think it's a huge opportunity both to provide the service and also, if Scotland had a full range of taxes, one of the things is the simplification of taxes. Tolley's has doubled in size in the last 15 years, and the font has gone down from 12 to 10, Tolley's being the tax guide. And therefore, it's not just about the levels of taxes, it's also about simplification of taxes as being seen as, if there is different parts of the country doing it differently, we can actually learn in how to do things better, both in simplification and in service to the customer who's trying to pay.
Thank you to both.
Malcolm, to be followed by Michael.
I think approaching from first principles is very helpful, irrespective of whether we agree with the principles or not. So can I home in on what I take to be the central principle of the campaign for Scottish Home Rule, which is that fiscal and spending responsibilities should be aligned. And Professor Trench had something interesting to say about that towards the end of his paper, challenging that on equity grounds. Can we leave that to one side for one moment? But also saying it's hard to see how it could be achieved. So I'm trying to get this clear in my head, because Professor Trench seems to be saying even if it was desirable, it can't be done, whereas clearly Ben Thompson, his group, is saying it can be done. So you would think that was just a matter of objective fact rather than opinion. But I suppose I'm slightly puzzled how Ben Thompson thinks he can do it, because he's so strongly against the assignment of revenues, which other people say we have to throw in to get anywhere near the requisite amount. So could we try and establish some facts around this? Perhaps Ben Thompson could say how, what suite of taxes would raise all the money we spend, including the welfare element that he supports.
Yes. At the moment, the total public sector expenditure in Scotland is, 63 billion. And that is financed from, 65 billion, and financed by 53 billion of tax raised in Scotland. And the remaining 12 is Scotland's deficit. That's 12, 13 figures. And that's funded at a UK level through debt. In terms of the deficit. And the UK's deficit over the last 9 years, I think Scotland's been better than the UK deficit on 5 out of the last 9 years, and worse in 4 out of the last 9 years. So what we're looking at is there is an overall pie of how revenue is generated in the UK, of which 80% of it comes from taxation and 20% of it at the moment comes from borrowing. And then there's the expenditure pie, of which 60% at the moment of the expenditure comes from, is delegated to, devolved to Scotland, and 40% is done at a UK level. So the pies match, and therefore it's not, there's no sort of magic about it. It's how you split up the pies, and at the moment the pies are very different. The pie for expenditure is 60-40, and the pie for revenue raise in terms of Scottish expenditure is 20% of that 60% is raised in Scotland. So we're just saying change the different taxes so that the two pies meet each other. And you can do that by both looking at devolving certain taxes, and part of our consultative process is which of the taxes that we've got do we want to devolve? Is it, should we be devolving national insurance? VAT is probably the one to leave at the UK level. Should we be devolving things like capital gains tax, inheritance tax, etc.? And then how much of that debt funding should be passed down to Scotland? So for the 12 billion, and we've devised also formulas for how that debt funding should be worked. So I don't see there's any sort of theoretical problem of saying the two pies equal each other, and you're just reallocating who's responsible for raising which bits of the revenue so that it matches your expenditure.
So let's leave aside the equity arguments, Professor Trench. So just in terms of the possibilities of doing that practically, why do you think it would be hard to achieve?
Well, I noticed Mr Thompson simply avoided the question of specifics. Now, which taxes are you going to devolve? What are the sources of revenue that if you are hypothetically going to fund that current, my figure is 65% of public spending in Scotland, and that's on last year's data. But if you're going to fund that 60, 65, 70% of public spending that currently is the responsibility of the Scottish Parliament, where are you going to find the revenues? Now, it is no use arguing about things like capital gains tax. It's a tiny source of revenue. You have to look at the major sources of taxation, and the major sources of taxation include personal income tax, VAT, two forms of national insurance contributions, which are, I would argue, two rather different sorts of taxes, alcohol and tobacco duties, at least if you combine them, and local taxation. Local taxation being the one that's devolved already. You can, if you want to quibble, throw into that little mix fuel duties and corporation tax. Both raise about 5-6% of total overall tax revenues, which means, from this point of view, they're useful but not particularly crucial to the argument. You've got to look at those big tax revenues. That is, the two sorts of national insurance contributions, local taxation as it currently stands, moving beyond that, personal income tax and VAT, and or North Sea oil revenues. Those are your big sources of tax revenue. The North Sea oil would be predicated, of course, on the basis that Scotland would receive a geographical share rather than a per capita share. And you then got a big set of arguments about control of the licensing regime, and indeed that ties into an argument about corporation tax. That's why you can't do it, I'm afraid. I can't make those numbers work.
I disagree on that, but I suppose you probably disagree even more fundamentally in terms of these equity arguments. Professor Trench said he thought that really a big element perhaps of block grant, if we can still use that term, was important as an expression of solidarity across the UK. So I suppose the one counter-argument you had, Professor Muscatelli, so first to Professor French, I mean, would the idea of an equalisation fund be possible even within the model that Ben Thompson is outlining? Would that still perhaps be possible? And I suppose the question to Ben Thompson is, well, what about this issue about solidarity and equalisation?
I'm not sure that an equalisation fund would be possible. It would certainly be able to do very, very little. And that in turn would mean that you're significantly attenuating the idea of any UK government role or a wider UK role in relation to Scotland and its public finances. And the question then is that compatible with the referendum result?
In answer to the question of the split, one of the things that I have done as part of the consultation that we're now going out to the public with in the campaign, which I shall certainly send you all when it's ready, is something called a Ready Reckoner. It actually sets down all the taxes on the one side and all the expenditures on the other side. There's a little chart at the bottom, and you can change the relative percentages in terms of the public of which taxes and which welfare benefits that you want. And at the end, it shows you how close you're getting to 100%. I tested it out in my family. They all managed to get to 100%, and they're only teenagers. So it's perfectly possible to do. It's a fun game to try, but actually it is totally perfectly possible to make the cakes work. And I hope the game will be available next week. So let me finish.
I'm interested to see that, but I fail to understand how you can play it as a game. But I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson, this is not a game. This is a serious matter of trying to deal with public administration and a fiscal system that is itself well established, highly concentrated, and subject to a variety of legal constraints. For example, as I believe I mentioned to the committee when I last gave evidence, you're in serious difficulties devolving excise duties thanks to the Treaty of Union. So we have to decide as part of a process of devolution whether the Treaty of Union is to be amended or not. You are unable, you also get into further tangles arising from European Union law, both state aids law, notably in relation to corporation tax but other taxes, and in relation to VAT and the requirement for a single VAT. So you cannot simply play a game that wishes away those constraints. These are constraints that this Parliament and the UK Parliament will be bound by.
I'm perfectly aware of that, and thank you for the interruption. I'm perfectly aware of that, and actually it incorporates that in the game that there are certain taxes like VAT you can't change because at the moment they don't work under VAT European legislation. But if I can continue, Chairman. The question that Malcolm raised was, what about an element of solidarity and redistribution? So let's just take the whole idea of home rule across the UK. Now, at the moment, out of the 740 billion that is spent in public services across the UK, 430 billion would be associated with home rule activities if England were to have the same home rule as the rest of the other 3 countries within the United Kingdom. So that represents around about 60% of all government expenditure. Now, that involves a huge amount of fiscal transfers right the way around the United Kingdom. And that, to our mind, is distorting the responsibility and the accountability of parliaments in each of the 4 home countries, or 3, because there isn't one yet in England. Now, if you took our model and looked at it across the 4 home counties, that each of them raised what they spent, and you allocated fairly on a per-head basis what the deficit is across the 4 home countries, the net result is that Scotland would break even over an average over the last 5 years because the Scottish deficit is roughly the same as the UK average deficit, that Wales and Northern Ireland is about £10 billion under, and it's difficult to get those figures because Wales haven't broken down their GERS figures since 10-11 figures, so we can't be totally accurate on that, but it's about 10 billion, even call it 15 billion. And England is a net contributor of about 10 and 15 billion, which goes to Wales and Northern Ireland. So if you did the home rule that we suggested right the way across the United Kingdom, that would be the result. Now, 15 billion in the context of the UK is about 2%. So in order to get a redistribution, solidarity, if you like, across the UK and keep the no detriment principle of where we start off with shouldn't be different from the current situation, there would have to be a redistribution of about 15 billion, which is about 2% of total revenue, or total expenditure in the UK. So with a 2%, we could actually achieve across the 4 countries within the UK a economic and needs-based fund to help those areas that either had run into economic difficulty or needed help with poverty alleviation on a needs basis, on the same methodology of someone like Holtham put forward in the Holtham report. Now, I asked the question to a number of people as to whether Scotland, if Scotland did fantastically well, let's say through oil, that people would feel comfortable in contributing in the region of 2 or maybe a little bit more percentage to help other people in Wales or Northern Ireland principally, but who knows what might happen to England going forward. And conversely, if Scotland ran into some problems, and let's say oil revenue disappeared and we needed some help, whether other people in the United Kingdom would. And it comes down to a relative degree. If this is 2 or 3% of the total budget, then I don't think people feel any problem with contributing that into a solidarity fund across the UK, which would be enough to address the balance on the current figures. What we're trying to avoid is the fiscal transfers at the moment that mean that 60% of expenditure at a local level is largely funded from Westminster, which results in these huge fiscal transfers which take away responsibility and the levers to do things in different economic parts of the United Kingdom. So you can achieve solidarity through a central economic and a needs-based fund to alleviate poverty at a Westminster level, and that can be a perfectly acceptable outcome for what Westminster should be doing.
So if there was a macroeconomic shock which affected Scotland differentially, or I suppose the other example that's often given in the long run is declining oil revenues, do you seriously think the rest of the UK would just think, oh well, we'll Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes,
That
I mean,
they
I think
would
there
just
are three events that could happen. One is a disaster. Let's say a nuclear bomb fell on London. Would we in Scotland be prepared to contribute a serious fund towards helping out another part of the UK? And I think most of us in Scotland would feel absolutely that if another part of the UK ran into a significant problem, we would go and help out in the same way that if another part of Europe or even another part of the world ran into a serious problem, we would help out, because that is in the nature of being part of a global society. The second thing is, what happens if a particular area of the United Kingdom ran into economic difficulty because its major industry was undermined? And that's where the Economic Development Fund works. I mean, it works in Europe. Half of the budget that we put into Europe goes on to an Economic Development Fund to help regions that need their economies improved. And the third thing is poverty alleviation. There are certain parts of the United Kingdom, just as there are certain parts of Europe, that actually need some assistance, and it's on a needs-based. And again, one can review that. One doesn't want to review it every year, so it becomes part of a sort of diminishing the responsibility. But on a 5 or 7 year basis, to actually review different parts of the United Kingdom so that you can see where there are problems on a needs basis, is a way that one can actually create a fund that achieves what you're trying to do, which is a solidarity across the UK, but represents a relatively small element and not the massive fiscal imbalances that happen, where 60% of money is sort of churned around the system through the centre.
So does that satisfy your concept of solidarity, Professor Trent?
I'm afraid it's not necessarily my concept. It's I think that would actually be any concept. I'm slightly puzzled that Mr. Thompson uses comparisons with the European Union, because many of the problems that the European Union has faced over the last decade or so have derived from the absence of any effective levers to deal with these things. It seems to me to turn the expression of UK social solidarity from being something that is actually tangible and meaningful into essentially the approach that Starbucks takes to paying its taxes. When it's caught out, it pays a bit more.
Okay, I think we'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Why, John?
Thank you, Convener. Just trying to understand. I think I understand Mr. Thompson's principles in terms of only raising what you spend, or spending what you raise, I suppose, is the right way to put it. And I understand as well, taking into account the debt balance, that the deficits are reasonably even over the period. So the principle of spending what you raise just does away with any requirements to look at things like indexed deduction approaches and what have you. You calculate what you raise and you spend that amount. Is that the basic principle?
I mean, the point being, if you want to spend more on a particular area and raise more tax and raise more revenues to fund it, then Scottish Government is then free to do so. It has the full responsibility and accountability to do what it wants to do. So if it wants to have free education or state-paid education, it can decide to do, at tertiary level compared to other parts of the United Kingdom that don't. It has the absolute freedom to do so, and it will have to balance that in what it raises in taxation. It's a perfectly logical approach.
Your children are using the Ready Reckoner, that's built into the calculations, or do you have to buy them a magic set to get rid of the Barnett formula at the same time?
No, it's not the two sides of what the UK or Scotland raises, or the segments of the pie, do match. Because you have 65 billion of expenditure in Scotland, you have 53 of tax raise in Scotland, and you have 12 of deficit. So, there are different ways of allocating those numbers, but the two slices, the two pies are the same. It's just how you allocate them in different ways so that you get 100% being raised in Scotland of what you spend.
So Scotland would have to be allocated its share of debt to pay at the same time?
It already does pay its allocated share of interest. Scotland's interest budget, I think, is around about 4 billion a year is contributed towards interest. So we already pay our fair share of the national debt. So the UK national debt at the moment, we should get our fair share of the of any new debt that's taken on each year. If the UBK becomes more balanced and we return to a position where we don't have a deficit, then Scotland will have to become more efficient to match the rest of the UK in terms of the deficit.
So would some complexity then come into the system that Scotland would have to be asked, or the Scottish Government would have to be asked if there was to be an increase in debt that the UK Government took on?
Now, what we're proposing is that, let's say next year the UK government has to borrow another £100 billion worth of debt, that Scotland would then get, one of the things that could be allocated to Scotland, its fair share of the debt, which would be 8.9 billion, because that's its per head of population. If Scotland wanted to raise more debt, because it wanted to do more things and raise debt, let's say invest in long-term infrastructure, it could do so, but under guidelines, just as local government has guidelines, under the overall monetary policy of the UK. If Scotland actually wanted to use that to reduce taxation, it could do so, because it now has the full levers to do that. Is that clear?
It's clear from, if you're looking at it from that perspective. If you look at it from the other side of the coin, if the UK wanted to increase debt but Scotland didn't want to increase debt, would Scotland have to raise taxes it didn't want to raise in order to pay debt that the UK government had taken on?
So if the UK raised a lot more debt than was needed in Scotland, and Scotland got its fair allocated share of the debt, then actually Scotland could either spend more or reduce taxes to match the fact that it was getting the benefit of the debt. Because if the debt is raised at a UK level, we'll still be paying the interest on that debt. Therefore, why shouldn't we get our fair share of it?
No, I understand the principles of that, but just who's going to make the decisions on the raising of the debt? If Scotland's going to have to increase its share of expenditure to meet that debt, it may not want to spend the money in that direction. How would you resolve that issue?
Well, it's not a decision of the debt. The debt actually comes out of the deficit. So the Chancellor in London, George Osborne, at the end of the year will say, oh dear, we've got a hole of about 20% more than what we've raised in taxes, which is about 120 billion. So how am I going to get cash to pay people? They're going to go and say, well, we're going to raise another 120 billion of debt. We will then have to pay our proportionate share of the interest on that debt. That happens already. And so at that stage, we should get whatever that share of debt is coming down to us. If that means Scotland actually has done very well because we've done things very efficiently and we've grown our industries, etc., that means we actually get a benefit and we can either spend more or actually have lower taxation, and that's all to the good.
Yeah, that all sounds very simplistic as well.
But then there must
Professor
be a flaw in it.
Trench, sorry, Professor Trench, you, in looking at some of the taxes that could be looked at, either devolved or assigned, you've said that you don't think that oil and gas is a suitable area in which to do that. Primarily, you say it's because that the receipts will be determined by such factors as extraction rate and global oil prices. But the UK doesn't have control over extraction rates and global oil prices, so why would that be a barrier to the development?
No, it doesn't, but it has two advantages when it comes to dealing with that. One is that the UK is a lot bigger, and the other is that the UK has and would on any basis have access to a much wider range of tax bases. If you go through the list of tax revenue, the list that sets out taxes and their revenues across the UK, what you'll notice is that there are a large number of taxes that generate individually quite small proportions of revenue, but cumulatively add up to quite a lot. That is one of the means by which the UK government's in a much better position to balance the wider range of risks that come with a highly volatile stream of revenue, like North Sea oil and gas. It's simply you manage volatile things at a higher level by someone who could spread the risk more evenly.
Yeah, no, I accept that, but it was just that you seem to be making the argument on the principle that the extraction rates and global prices were not under the control of the Scottish Government. Therefore, that's the reason why we shouldn't devolve it.
Oh, no,
the argument is it's because it's actually better handled at the macro level.
I'm sorry if my argument was misunderstood. I'd entirely agree with that. It's better handled at the macro level, particularly when you would be, if you're looking at it as a source of revenue, and you'd have to look at it as a source of revenue, you are funding costs, you're funding public services that have this rather annoying spending profile of being both generally inflationary but also counter-cyclical. The spending profile of both health and education is that they go up all the time, but they go up particularly when times are bad. And you want a stable source of revenue rather than one that's, or indeed a counter-cyclical one to help balance those costs. Alcohol duties, slightly ironically, appear to be about the only tax that does fit that bill.
Okay, thanks, Convener.
Thank you. John, to be followed by Gavin.
Thanks, Convener. Professor Trench, in your June paper that you gave us, you commented on full fiscal devolution, and you said, amongst other things, it would be incompatible with anything like the existing UK welfare state, and a referendum vote for Scotland to remain part of the UK therefore also has to be regarded as a rejection by Scottish voters of the idea of full fiscal autonomy. I mean, is that something you still hold to, and do we know why people voted no in the referendum?
You will have been active campaigning, no doubt. I was not, so you, in that sense, are in a better position to know. What we do know is that they voted to remain in the United Kingdom on the basis of, as it were, the United Kingdom remaining intact, but with further devolution along the lines that the pro-UK parties had already indicated through their various schemes, if people had dug down into that level of detail.
Mm-hmm. I mean, my impression certainly was, as you suggest, speaking to people, that there was a whole variety of reasons why people voted no. So it's very difficult to, for me, I find to say that because they voted no, therefore something else is particularly clear. I mean, the particular issue I'm interested in is the welfare state and pensions. And as I understand it, I mean, we spend approximately the same in Scotland as the rest of the UK on social protection, i.e. pensions and benefits together. So devolving all of pensions and benefits would not actually cause a big problem.
That's not quite right from my recollection of the figures, and it's a little while since I looked at those. From recollection, the overall level of welfare spend in Scotland is slightly, but only slightly higher than on a per capita basis than that of the UK as a whole, on a population share basis than the UK as a whole. So there is a slight extra level of payment within Scotland.
Is that just like benefits excluding pensions then?
No, that's overall on the budget. As I say, it's a while since I looked at this. The particular issue, there is, of course, as you know, a particular issue in relation to pensions, and that doesn't relate to current payments but to demography and to the age profile of the Scottish population, which is likely to cause a significant further burden in paying public pensions in the coming 2 or 3 decades.
In the sense that our people are dying earlier, and if they start living longer, they'll need more pensions.
Well, and that you have more middle-aged people who are going to be claimants and fewer younger people who are going to be able to work to pay for those pensions.
Mm-hmm. Unless we can solve immigration. I mean, Mr Thompson, you also referred to pensions in your paper, and you talk about even if only those welfare powers that were linked to existing Holyrood responsibilities were devolved, brackets, with the main exception of pensions, maternity, paternity pay and free TV licences. Does that mean these are issues that you don't think should be devolved, or...?
They certainly should. I mean, as part of our consultation process, we are asking people about those particular areas, but there seems to be more of a dividing line and a resistance to moving pensions and maternity benefits down, and there seems to be 2 reasons for that. One is that pensions the demographics of pensions does look particularly difficult going forward. As you're aware, the pensions in the public sector are by and large unfunded, as is the state pension, unlike other countries like Australia that are starting to fund their pensions. So it's a major liability going forward, and people have real concerns about the state of that liability. And so having something in a greater collective is gives them greater assurance than having it split down. That's why we have our pension funds with large companies rather than smaller companies, because you actually get a benefit in size on that particular issue. And the second thing that people look at in pensions is it does provide, over a lifetime, if you're moving between different parts of the UK, some consistency that your pension is going to be, at the end of it, the state pension is going to be the same. So there's a sort of simplicity argument in that. So there are some good arguments about why pensions should remain, but we haven't ruled it out one way or the other, because that's part of the consultative process we're doing at the moment, to look at the specifics and going out to the public about attitudes towards the different specifics behind the principle.
Because, I mean, do you think then that is it because people want their pensions to be exactly the same as the rest of the UK that's an important issue, or is it just that they're afraid that they might be lower than the UK? And if they were to be higher than the UK, people would be perfectly happy to have separate pensions.
I mean, if you look at in terms of voting intentions, the people who were of a retirement age certainly had seemed to have in the referendum more concerns about what was going to happen going forward. And one of the big factors for them was the uncertainty around pensions. So it's an area that I think one does need proper consultation about people's attitudes towards pensions and the demographics going forward. So again, I come back to it. That's part of what we're trying to go out with at the moment, to see what is it that people see as being powers that should rest more naturally with the rest of the UK. And I've given you a couple of arguments for why people are saying pension should possibly remain as a UK reserved matter.
Yeah, I mean, I think was it yourself, Professor Trench, that used the phrase UK social solidarity.
And indeed, and a UK and I would certainly agree that pensions are a key element of a UK social union.
And do you think is that just because people are afraid that their pensions might be lower if we were not connected to the or they weren't done jointly?
It's on the basis that that's of a matter of principle.
That even the people would not want higher pensions.
I'm sure people would like higher pensions, and actually the Devo Moore and welfare recommendations would enable people in Scotland possibly to have higher pensions. Again, that would be a matter for the Scottish Parliament to determine. But the idea of there being a UK state pension, which is payable to all who have made the necessary contributions during their working lives, and which they can receive no matter where they live, seems to me a fairly key element of being a citizen of a single country rather than a citizen of multiple countries. Now, to elaborate on the point about possibly higher pensions in Scotland, again, this would be something that it would be open to this Parliament to determine using the supplementing mechanism that we proposed, that it would be open to the Parliament to decide that, that some or all pensioners, depending on such criteria as it saw fit, would be entitled to higher levels of payments. And that could be directly by means of some supplemental pension. It could be by means of some sorts of additional allowances in other areas. I mean, of course, pension is not the only benefit that goes to older people. Things like winter fuel allowances, the over 75s TV licence, and so on. But that then becomes a decision for people to make here. And as Mr. Thompson rightly says, if it's a key element of labour mobility that you're able to make a decision about where you're going to take work and have your working life that's independent of the pension that you will receive. So you know that your UK pension is going to be available to you, even though you've been, let us say, born in Kirkcaldy, educated in Bangor in Wales, worked in Bangor, Northern Ireland, and then in Bognor Regis, and you then decide to retire to Hunstanton. But you're able to enjoy.
Is that purely because it's unfunded? Because if it was funded, like if you worked in local government, for example, and especially in Scotland, it would be fully funded, perhaps less so in England, but you could move around and that would be quite secure because it was in a definite pot. So if we move towards a funded system, do you think, will that change?
Well, one's pension through schemes like the local government pension scheme and the university's superannuation scheme, which are fully funded schemes, at least in principle, your benefits in those cases get frozen if you're no longer working in that service. So that's somewhat different, and those are able to operate on I think USS works UK-wide, and I think LGPS works on is GB, but not Northern Ireland, but I may be wrong about that. And those are both quite important elements of flexibility for those areas of the public service, as the unfunded schemes for people like the medical pension scheme and the teachers' pension scheme are. But those are occupational pensions, and that's something different. And I mean, if you wanted to move to a wholly funded pension scheme, there were some quite strong arguments for that, but you've got to work out how you get there from here. Which is something that's defeated almost everybody, everybody who's tried to work that one out for public pensions for a long time.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much.
Just to clear that up, there is a slight confusion between, there are two things here. The state pension, which obviously is different from public sector workers' pensions.
Yes. So
the state pension is totally unfunded, although national insurance was originally supposed to be set up to create it, but it isn't. There's no fund of any substance that pays out on the state pension, and on public service pensions, yes, some of them are funded, but very few of them are fully funded to meet the liabilities of the final salary pension scheme. Theoretically, if you could fund those, you wouldn't have a problem because everyone would have their own pot of money, and therefore it would go wherever they went,
even if they retired to Spain or whatever.
Exactly.
Okay, to move on, Mr. Thompson, in your paper you talk about, I think, the idea of going back to what we have touched on already, this kind of sharing. If one part of the UK was not doing so well, there's a bit of sharing resources. It talks about such a shared UK-wide monetary and fiscal regime should be to ensure that areas of the UK with economic and social difficulties should have access to support through redistribution, and that Scotland would therefore make its fair share. I mean, how does that tie in with an area that does well, attracts tourists, attracts business, is more successful, and then would all the benefits just be taken away to the bit that had been less successful?
Well, I think I answered this question earlier, which is an extent of quantum. And the question I'd ask you is, at the moment, it would take about 2% of total tax expenditure, total public sector expenditure to redistribute amongst the 4 home countries to achieve equalisation on current figures.
Yes, so, I just wonder, is that 2%, is just a wee bit of a fluke that it's so low at the moment? I mean, does that...
No, I mean, part of the reason is that England is such a large part of everything. You then have to look at, when those powers come down to Holyrood would also have to think carefully that if it was going to devolve powers to local government, that the same redistribution argument would work in Holyrood, that how do you make sure that a rural area that is having economic difficulties, let us say, actually has some redistribution from a wealthy area in Scotland. So the reason it's so small is because Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales only represents about 15% of the total population of the UK. But it does mean that if you're looking for home rule across the 4 countries of the United Kingdom, which is the solidarity principle, it's actually a relatively small redistribution fund that is needed to either help with economic development in areas that need economic development or help with poverty alleviation.
Yeah, I mean, I do take that point. I think my concern was what happens if Scotland does quite well and let's say the north of England does quite badly, and then that would be a big area for us to try and bail them out.
But I think it comes to quantum. If you're saying to me, would you mind that 3%, 2%, 3%, something less than 5% actually goes into redistribution of wealth, then I think people would say, if Scotland did fantastically well, we don't mind contributing something to the rest of the UK. But that doesn't need to go hand in hand with having 60% of a redistribution of money through fiscal transfers, where the money goes into the centre and then comes back down locally. Okay.
The final area I wanted to touch on was the kind of your suggestion about local government, that we should distribute, we should push subsidiarity down the way as well, which I think a lot of us are sympathetic with. I mean, would you go as far as allowing local government then to choose which taxes they had? Because we're saying that Scotland should be allowed to choose, do we want this tax or that tax? Would we therefore allow local government to say, well, we do want council tax, or we'll have a tourist tax instead of council tax, that kind of thing?
Yes, I think that if you're, the principles are exactly the same. And one of the things that I think has been talked about a lot is the Scandinavian model. One of the things about the Scandinavian model which has been so impressive is that they've actually pushed many more powers down to a community level. And, you know, there are 400-odd local communities in Norway, same sort of number in Sweden.
Right, well, that was exactly my next point. What size should a community be then in that case, or is there not a right answer? Because we've got small authorities like Clackmannan and big ones like Glasgow and Lanarkshire.
Yeah, and I think to some extent that comes from history and the local community itself deciding the size of their community. So Orkney, for instance, would see itself as very much its own community, and its size, though, is much smaller than Edinburgh or Glasgow, and works perfectly well. In fact, Orkney is one of the few areas in Scotland where all the sort of regions actually overlapped, where you had policing and health and local government all being in the same region, which actually meant you could create more holistic programs of solving problems, which is not necessarily true for other parts in Scotland.
So for a council, if I take South Lanarkshire, then, I mean, their community, they might feel it was Hamilton or in East Kilbride and Rutherglen rather than South Lanarkshire. So, I mean, potentially you push even further down below the council level.
Yeah, I think it's important to get down to local, to as far down as you possibly can. Now, you might find certain communities actually prefer to be part of something that is bigger, and others prefer to be something that is smaller. I think the size overall becomes too much of an issue. It's what the community wants, but if a community wants it, subsidiarity should be passed down to a lower form of government that wants to take on the responsibilities for those outcomes that's suitable for them to take on.
Okay, thanks so much.
Gavin.
Thank you. I think most issues have been covered, but just a couple of brief ones. First one to Professor Trench. When you talked about block grant adjustment, I found your suggestion of impartial mediation to be attractive. However, though, in order for that to work, whoever was making the decision would have to be completely impartial. They'd have to have incredible knowledge of the inner workings of the financial system and have sufficient gravitas for everyone to abide by the result. I mean, in your view, do these people exist?
I suspect they don't exist as single individuals, and if they do, they will be greatly in demand. The institutional mechanism that most closely corresponds to this is the model of the Commonwealth Grants Commission in Australia. Now, there's a good deal about the Commonwealth Grants Commission that I don't, and system that in which it operates, that I'm not wholly impressed by. I think the level of detail that the Australian system requires and the way it equalises isn't ideal. But the Commonwealth Grants Commission is an impartial commission. It's established under a federal, a Commonwealth statute, a federal statute, and is technically merely an advisory body. It has about 8 members. The previous chairman, I remember, came and gave evidence here and took part in various meetings here during the work of the Calman Commission, a man called Alan Morris. And the members have backgrounds in varying places that include government, both as politicians and as civil servants, private sector academia, and so forth. So they're able collectively to exercise a much higher degree of wisdom. They are then constituted formally as advisors to the Commonwealth Treasurer, the Commonwealth equivalent to the Chancellor of the Exchequer at UK level. In reality, their advice is binding. It isn't formally binding, but it is the sort of advice that, in a sense, it's analogous to the advice that's given to the sovereign. So it's highly authoritative and it has never been departed from.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Just second question then. If income tax were to be devolved in its entirety, your preference would be for HMRC to work at a national level as opposed to passing it to Revenue Scotland. If that were to happen, though, I mean, you're arguing that there'd have to be substantial changes with the way HMRC operates and in terms of who they're accountable to.
Indeed. I mean, there's already been mention made of the many problems with the functioning of HMRC, and I don't think anyone would quibble with that. I suspect your committee's in a remarkably good place to understand the nature of those, given your ongoing work. And this is, of course, the performance of HMRC is regularly considered and criticised by a number of committees at Westminster, including the Public Accounts Committee. But I still think that that HMRC ends up being the best agency of those around to undertake that. If I might, I'd like that there is one further point that I perhaps should have mentioned earlier. in relation to a question that Mr Gibbs, that the convener asked. And that's about the nature of income tax devolution, because one omission from the current schemes has been savings and dividends income. And I think ideally you get to the point where actually savings and dividends income would also form part of income tax devolution. Even if you agree with that as a matter of principle, however, there are really serious operational difficulties with achieving it, because by definition, the tax status of a payment by way of savings, interest or dividend goes to an individual, and the tax liability therefore depends on the individual's tax status, which the person paying the dividend or the interest payment has no means of knowing. So you need a system, if you were to move to that point, to provide that, put that information in the hands of the payer, and that in turn is going probably to increase the the compliance burden on the payer of the interest or the dividend.
Okay, thank you. Mr Thompson, just two questions for you. One is, I mean, the principle of being responsible for raising what you spend. The convener asked if you believe that should be the case at a local government level as well, and I think you indicated that that was your view. He did raise, I think, an interesting point, though. I mean, if you look at the taxes that local government currently collect, you've got council tax, which is about 2 billion, and business rates, which is just over 2 billion. So your view is that you'd remove the freeze, so council tax would increase. Business rates could probably go up, but I suspect there'd be a limit to that. So you're not much above 4 billion. Obviously, local government expenditure is between 10 and 11 billion at the moment. So I mean, how's your organisation looked at how that, in any kind of detail, how that gap might be plugged, and what sort of taxes are you talking about, or is it more at a kind of a principal level at this stage?
Funnily enough, there's a very good slide in Alan's lecture, I think you did last week, which shows you where principal taxes come from. And there are three principal sources of taxes that really work, and that as Alan puts in his paper, are described as good taxes. And those are taxes on income, i.e. employee taxes, taxes on property, and taxes on sales. So we have all three of those in this country, and most countries, over 85% of taxation comes from those principal forms. So for employees, it's national insurance and income tax, etc. And that all the rest are pretty periphery taxes. So everything like corporation tax, capital gains tax, inheritance tax, etc., is really just the sort of the last little bit. It is perfectly possible to construct, and I come back to those same two pies, it's perfectly possible to construct how local government could work, if it so choose, so that it matched funding with expenditure using those three taxes. And by way of a useful graph, which I can send in to the committee, it's quite interesting to see how in the US, the 50 different states actually operate within those three taxes. And what this particular graph, which I will send you, shows you is that states like Nevada compared to Oregon, which are broadly similar, they raise roughly the same amount in revenue. One has no income tax at all, and the other one has no sales tax at all. They've blended it in different ways because that is what their voting public wanted, and obviously suited their local economies better for what they were trying to do and what the society in each of those states wanted. And it's quite interesting, the range of different taxes at different states enables them to do things in a very different way and appeal to their own local electorate in the way that they want to do it. So there's no difficulty in constructing a set of taxes at a local level in the same way you can construct a set of taxes at a Holyrood level, so that segment of the pie of revenue matches the segment of the pie for expenditure.
Okay, thank you. And last question then, again on this principle of raising what you spend, it's just something that's come into my head as you've been answering, so I don't have figures in front of me, and you may not have an answer right now, but if you stick to this principle 100%, which I guess is the view of your group, if you add all of welfare and benefits onto the current Scottish Government expenditure, you're adding 16.5 billion, 16.4 onto the 38. But you're also automatically excluding VAT which is removing, I think, about 10, I don't know, it's about 10 billion away from the 53.
8, isn't it, I think, VAT.
Well, figures I have in front of me date back to 2010-11, and it was 16 billion.
VAT?
So it was about, sorry,
For
about
V-
7.5.
7.5.
Okay,
So
so
8's about the right figure.
So my question is, and I don't expect an immediate, but if you add all of welfare on and you automatically exclude VAT, even if you devolved every single aspect of every single other tax, you know, can you actually get to that principle? So is it a principle that you think broadly ought to be achieved, or are you sort of saying this has to be 100% for your group to be satisfied?
It's a good question, because you're reaching almost the limits if you do everything with that and you hold back VAT. So let's look at the numbers. I think it's about 8 billion is VAT, roughly speaking. And if you look at the things that are left, you've got financial, which is about 4.5 of expenditure. You've got defence and protection, so that's central agencies, which I think is another sort of 2 or no, defence a bit higher, so 3.5. And then you've got things like Europe, aid. So yes, you'd be stretching it. There wouldn't be much left by way of other taxes. VAT would pretty much be the UK tax if you took out everything, but it would still be covered.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. That has concluded the questions from the committee and indeed myself in this very lively session. I'd like to thank you both for your contributions. Just wonder if there's any final points either of you would like to make before we wind up the session.
No, thank you, Ravina.
Cool, thank you.
I was only just going to say that I welcome the Smith Committee. I think it is absolutely great that the parties are making the initiative, and it's great that there have been so many submissions. But I do think we would like to see the Smith Commission coming out with some principles and not just horse trade over specifics. And it would be good to feel that there was cross-party agreement on those principles in the same sort of way that we've done with the campaign. And that when looking at the specifics, when something's devolved, it should be properly devolved. And we don't think that assigned revenues actually is proper devolving. It needs to be a full devolvement of the tools needed to do the job.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Now, at the start of this morning's committee meeting, the committee voted to have the next 2 items in private session, so I'll now close this public meeting and just have a couple of minutes break to enable our witnesses to leave and also the official report.